were contacted at the level I was after our last webcast, I think we don't need to underestimate the number of people that are watching this deliberation. So I'm calling you to be the best of who you are.
I need to remind you that the Undergraduate Education Advisory Committee functions within the Open Meetings Act. The agenda for the meeting was posted in the Texas Register timely. And we have to let you know that Ron Swain will be here this afternoon. He had something this morning. Roberto Aguero was not able to be with us. He let me know very late yesterday, but said he will be watching, so we hope he is. And Roberto, let us know how we sound. And Russell told me that Donna texted him this morning from El Paso, and there's an issue with flights, so she will not be with us. So we'll hope that she'll also be watching.
Definitely. We have Lorraine and Danita here as guests again today to integrate the assessment conversation with the things that we're going to discuss. And we have a new student member. Do you want to introduce him, Kathy?
Yeah, I'd like to introduce Christopher Redden, who is a student at the midpoint of his undergraduate career at the University of Houston. Christopher is one of a number of students who applied to serve as a student non-voting member of this committee. And there's an application form people have to fill out if they want to serve, and they have to write an essay and provide a lot of information about themselves. And Lucy was kind enough to serve on the selection committee, which is agency-wide. We have student representatives on this committee, the Graduate Education Advisory Committee, the Distance Education Advisory Committee, the Financial Aid Committee, and the Apply Texas Committee. So we have 5 of our committees, plus the board itself, that have student representation now. And I'd like to welcome Christopher and ask him to tell us a little bit about himself and what he hopes to bring to the meetings.
Hi, everyone. As she said, I'm Christopher Redden. I will be a junior in the fall at the University of Houston. I'm a double major in political science and history and a double minor in English literature and an interdisciplinary program in politics and ethics called Phronesis. I'm really excited to be serving with you all, and I hope to be able to bring the student perspective to the deliberations that are continued to be ongoing before this meeting.
Well, I think as a committee we welcome you, and our previous student rep was a really important element to the discussion of this committee and was a vocal element to this committee, and so we want you to not be shy.
This is Christopher's second trip to Austin this week. We did an orientation for all the new student representatives on Tuesday. And so he has definitely gotten the message, don't be shy, speak up, we value your voice. So we're inviting him to jump in, and I think he will bring a really good perspective to the committee.
A couple of issues before we dive into the formal part of the meeting. One of our members and former co-chair, Larry Garrett, isn't here today. His wife is
here in Austin,
having thyroid surgery, and so our thoughts are with both of them and their new young child. And this will be my last meeting as chair of this committee. While I'll remain and fulfill my duties, I've taken the position of Vice President for Academic Affairs at Amarillo College and start there July 1. So, as Rex said earlier this week, I've crossed over to the right side. I've into the community college world. Excited about that. So at our next meeting, we will be selecting a new co-chair from the university division. So we'll be asking you to think about that. You have the minutes from our previous meeting in front of you. Are there any discussion on these minutes that we need to have?
I would just like to ask a question. In my experience with minutes before, most of the time the general conversation of the group is not referred to person by person, but the motions and that sort of thing are identified by people, but I notice in the minutes that there are, it indicates which person raised which thing, and I don't have a particular problem with that, but sometimes that might be a bit constraining in terms of the discussion of the group, and I think my preference would be to include names when there's motion and second, but to include the discussion as a discussion of the group as a whole.
Any discussion on that discussion point?
I don't object to the way it's done, or I wouldn't object to that either. It's not a big thing. I don't feel constrained one way or the other. We've noticed.
One of the reasons we call it a meeting summary is so that, because the information is so important around the state, we want to provide a little bit more information about the substance of the meeting. Sometimes minutes only reflect official calls for motions and votes on motions. And we have done the minutes for this committee that way in previous years, but we felt that this was so significant that we wanted to include a summary. So I think Celia's point is well taken, and if you all don't object to that, we'll modify our meeting summary process.
I don't find people particularly hesitant, but but I think it might be helpful.
So with those changes in removing names where appropriate, are there any other discussions of the minutes? Hearing no discussion, all in favor of approving the minutes, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay. Lucy and Catherine have, and the community leadership have created a process today that I think is going to be rather important. I think every meeting we've had in the last 3 years has been really important. I think this one is going to be particularly important and is going to require the height of our professionalism and our focus, because it would be easy to get stuck in one area for the next 3 meetings, and we're asked to deal with all component areas in one meeting. So we need to stay focused, and we need to check each other on staying focused. But to catch us up, we're just going to walk through where we are to this point. We have approved the purpose already. The purpose of the core is through the core curriculum, students will gain a foundation of knowledge of human cultures and the physical and natural world, develop principles of personal and social responsibility for living in a diverse world, and advance intellectual and practical skills that are essential for all learning. So we need to use this purpose as we're developing the descriptions of component areas today to check our work. We've identified already the 6 core objectives: critical thinking skills, communication skills, empirical and quantitative skills, teamwork, social responsibility, and personal responsibility. These are the descriptions that we've all approved previously, and I won't read them to you, but I think they're quite exceptional. I don't know if you've had the same experience I did, but after our last meeting and taking this back to my own campus, as you've taken it back to yours, the reaction I've gotten has been overwhelmingly positive and exciting. But I think also concerned in how it's going to be executed. And I think that's why today's meeting is particularly important. Do you want to...
Which brings us to the bulk of today's meeting. And if you'll notice, agenda item number 2 is discussion regarding revisions to the core curriculum, and then we have A, B, and C. And what we'd like to do is actually take item 2B first and actually discuss the knowledge-based component area descriptions and objectives. So we have our foundational component areas that we agreed to at the last meeting: communications, mathematics, and so on. And what's the next? Got the next one.
And what we were charged with at our last meeting was to take this chart back to our campuses and get reactions. So in fulfilling your charge at the previous meeting, what kind of reactions have you gotten to this particular mapped chart.
Very positive, really, because we did give them the option to include, other areas. My folks were happy with it.
Guardedly optimistic.
What was the guarded part?
Guarded, I think, came a great deal from something that we had talked about in our previous meeting, was going to be that potential conflict in perception between content area and core objectives, whether or not there is time to do everything.
Well, and I think the most exciting conversation that I've heard in discussing of this map previously this week in a meeting was that this is going to require us to have pedagogical and even curricular changes for courses to fulfill these elements of the core and to be included in the core. So the rubber meets the road when, as leaders in our own institutions, we guide our colleagues through a rethinking of how they execute these things in their classes.
Which was the biggest problem on our campus, because we're like in the fourth year of redoing our core, and we've gotten it where we want it. And so this is a bit of a threatening discussion, and led to some questions about, and I think it is a good thing for a conversation in this group, is about what is the role of the state and what is the role of the institution, and how do we marry those? Because you want I feel like our discussion on our campus has been a very positive, productive one, but melding the two, and actually what we've put out as objectives will meld fine with what we're doing. The concern is being able to kind of delineate those roles and make sure that the state guidance is broad enough to cover the gamut, and flexible enough to allow specific campuses to carry out the focused concerns of that campus, and to own it well. Because if you're doing it on the campus, owning it is extremely important for carrying it out with the students, and that was the tension. I think the conceptual piece was well embraced.
Michael?
Really good.
Well, I think reaction on our campus was all over the place. Bristly is not a bad descriptor. We began in '99 by making the decision that we would have very few courses that were used to fulfill the core requirements, and we kind of created super courses that did everything we wanted them to do. And they tended to be a mile wide and a foot deep, and not terribly satisfying to anyone. And so over time we kind of relaxed those criteria and allowed more and more things to count for the core. And now the conversation, I hear people going, well, maybe I'd just like to take my class back, rather than to have to once again re-engineer it. So we're in the middle of that conversation. I suspect we will find some middle ground, so that there are probably fewer classes than before, but a lot more than when we began.
Any other comments that you have from the field, so to speak?
I think the biggest reaction we had on the negative side was figuring how do you evaluate these things within the class, and again, how
Very
much
carefully.
I think it's what we talked about earlier. We say you can change the curriculum, but unless you change perception of the faculty, you're not going to change the core. And that dialogue was going on. Not that they're saying it won't happen, but they realize the scope of the issue.
Yeah, and I think Celia raises an excellent point about the tension between how much guidance does the state provide on how to address these things versus the kind of independence and flexibility that you want at the institution. And I know that personally I struggle with that divide between trying to talk about the independence of the institution, and that's important, but I think we also need to keep in mind that the other part of that is serving those students who more and more have a tendency to move from one institution to another institution. And how do we serve them well while at the same time trying to accomplish the individual missions of colleges and universities and departments and so on. And I think that is a huge tension. One of the things we talked about earlier this morning is that if we can settle on the definitions of the foundational component areas and reach some consensus about those things, just as we've reached some consensus about the core objectives, then in some respects the real work then is going to commence after that in delineating just exactly what kind of guidance is going to come from the state, and how flexible versus how prescriptive is that, and so forth. So I think there's still much work to be done in terms of that, so that guarded optimism, which I understand perfectly well, then becomes more optimistic than otherwise.
I think that was our issue, is that we had just extensively looked at our core and actually revised it into something very similar to this, which was exciting. But then thinking, like with transfer, what the rules would be for what our students, how they would be able to take that somewhere else and be accepted, and then what we would have to do when students came from other places with parts of that core, and then how you're going to figure that out and what the direction will be from the coordinating board. So, but as far as the areas and all of that, we were real excited to see. It was very similar to where we wanted to go.
And to add, as far as University of Houston, when we first look at this as presented to the undergraduate council, which is the council that approves all the coursework and in the core and all that for our university, they're very happy in how we are looking at the 6 areas of critical thinking, communication skills, especially teamwork and social responsibility, personal responsibility, and so on. And of course, the assessment is always the issue. So I actually have our assessment director there too, that we talk about how we've been doing the assessment already. And I think what also helped is that a couple of years ago, Catherine actually visited our undergraduate council and talked about the core will be changing and so on. So we're waiting for that already. Now we're waiting for what the state and what our group will come together to figure out what the selection criteria is how can classes be in part of this group, and then how we can work with our assessment specialists to do the proper assessments.
Well, I think that's a good transition to the next slide then, because I think as we talk about the work that we've done and we deal with the perception issues that Dick brought up with faculty, as a committee moving forward, we've got to reframe how we talk about the core as well. And Lucy created this visual I think is really important. When we talk about the core curriculum moving forward, we don't need to talk about the component areas because they're just an execution element. We need to talk about these objectives. This is how we're reframing the core curriculum. This is the point of the core curriculum. These are the things that we'll be assessing from the core curriculum. As these 6 outcomes that we spend a lot of time developing and wordsmithing, and the component areas are just the execution of that. That may help us when we talk to our colleagues, especially faculty, in reframing how they see the core. The core is not that we're proposing really, in essence, is drastically different than the core that we are working from now, and this is a good representation of that shift. As we dive into the next portion, were you or Agnes going to read? In our preparation meeting this morning, Kevin read an element of the report that we did as a committee, and I think it's a really good starting point to check our next conversations against. So this is what we said we wanted from the core.
Yeah, this comes from the Undergraduate Education in the 21st Century report that was one of the first product of this committee. Recommendation 2A reads, reconsider the Texas core curriculum to ensure that it reflects current and future demands on student knowledge and skills. But then in the report we went on to talk about what some of those things are. And one of the lines from it is time to reconsider the Texas core curriculum in order to better prepare students for the global culture of the new century. The revised core curriculum will have to respond to both the needs of the global workforce and the intellectual, aesthetic, and social changes emerging during the new century. Graduates will have to be prepared to meet these challenges. And I think it's important to kind of keep in mind some of the sort of the parameters that the committee set on the revision of the core in the first place. And as you look at these foundational areas and the descriptions that have been created by the work groups for them, then kind of keep in mind, are we addressing the purpose of the core curriculum, which was the first slide we had up there, and is it addressing the kinds of things that was originally raised in our recommendation?
The 6 outcomes that we created fulfill that recommendation. The reason today's meeting is so important is the descriptions for the component areas have got to link to these outcomes and fulfilling the charge that we laid out for ourselves in our initial report. So here's the structure for the day. We're going to discuss each one of these elements in the group that you started with, to bring back kind of a summary of your conversation that can serve as a starting point for developing the paragraph that will describe how each component area fulfills the charge of the core.
And what we want, we're going to divide into the 4 work groups that we had, which we're calling the Day Group, Carroll Group, Coleman Group, and Williamson Group, after the chairs. But what we want the Day Group to do, for example, is to look at not their own work, but the work of the other 3 groups. Okay? And so, and then the Carroll Group would look at the work of the other 3 groups, not their own work. And then, as a group, see if you can reach some kind of consensus to report back to the entire committee on reflecting on those. And then we'll ask for some group reports and then some discussion from those.
And I'm going to throw a curveball really quick. If each of the chairs could take about 60 seconds to frame your conversation for us as we go into our work groups, that would be, I think, really helpful. So, Danny, do you want to, in the paragraphs that you're proposing, is there anything that you think we need to know or understand to frame that conversation?
I mean, do you want to know what we did? How we approached it?
No.
I don't
know what you want to know.
I don't need to know process, but is there a philosophical conversation that you want us to think through as we go through what you created?
Okay. One of the things that I think our group thought was really important was to pay attention to the previous work that had been approved by this group and look at the areas on the chart, the map, and say, okay, if, for example, humanities is supposed to include critical thinking, communication skills, and social responsibility as definites, and the others are optional, we need to make sure that in our paragraph we support those items. So I think looking at what the previously approved work of the committee was as part of our direction was important to us. Is that?
Yes, that's helpful.
Good. Okay. Carol?
Okay, our group looked at the legislation that had already been written because we had the social science area. And I think the only element of confusion was whether or not we were describing what was supposed to happen in the core classes or if we were looking at the component area as a whole. So do we pull in the things that happen at the junior and senior level, or are we just looking at the freshman, sophomore? And we decided that the core was what we were doing.
Yes, good. Okay. Yeah. Is the Coleman group?
I would say we've provided 3 descriptions in life and physical sciences, 2 descriptions in mathematics. In each of those, the first of the descriptions are the most abstract, and they really focus on kind of a lens through which to view the world. so that you look from the mathematical perspective. You judge things from the perspective of scientific literacy. They're followed then by definitions that are more elaborative of the things that comprise them, the elements within them. It's tough to write a description that covers the whole landscape of higher education, and so in some ways the kind of lens approach might be more useful in that it is less specific about how you get there, but fairly specific about what the end is. So I think that's, just as a very loose structure, would be a way to think about the differences between the definitions we provided.
Great, thank you. And the Williamson Group.
Yeah, I think we were a little more all over the map. And I guess listening to what you're saying and trying to conceptualize our chore for today, if you've got this on the coordinating board website, and 3 years from now somebody who is not in this group wandered to that site, what is it that we want them to gain when they look at that couple of sentences? I guess that's what I'm trying to ask myself right now. And is it to gain an understanding of what that component area is, which is kind of the descriptions that we have right now. Math is this, behavioral science is that, visual arts is this. Is it a question of what that particular component area contributes to the objectives, which is a different sort of, what is it that we're trying to say to the audience? And I'm not sure that we addressed that as a group as we kind of wandered our way through the process. So that's a chore that we'll need to take on. But from what I'm hearing today, you're saying it is not a description of what math is or what communication is, but a description of how that area needs to contribute to the objectives. One of the catch-22s we have with our group is that communication appears in both. And really trying to keep our heads sorted around what is it that the objective communication needs to do for us, and what is it that the foundation area communication needs to do for us.
Well, I think
that's a slippery slope in some ways.
This conversation is about the foundation, the foundational areas, the communication foundation as it relates to the objectives.
So to ask it concretely, which was a question among our group, is the objectives talk about oral, written, visual. The foundation area, does that need to address oral, written, visual? I mean, that's where we kept kind of, I think, finding ourselves at some difficulty in ferreting that out.
Would the foundational level be more specific than the objective level?
Yes.
Okay.
I was going to say one thing. This may be a good time. One of the questions that I had earlier with the small subgroup that had been working on this was, this to me looks like the first stage in developing a selection criterion map for courses that would go into the core curriculum. And some of you mentioned this earlier, but you're trying to, I think at your institution, is trying to figure out to what extent do you need to elaborate on some of these things in order to help institutions determine what courses would satisfy the core objectives that are identified for any given component. I don't think it's here, but it may be coming out of what you're working on in your descriptions of the components. That's just in my brief scan of those. That sounds like one of the possible outcomes. Do you agree?
No, I think that's exactly right. And while it may not, while the descriptions of the foundational component areas may not result in, I guess one way to put it, in as much guidance as we would like, it's certainly the next step. Drafting that kind of guidance to the institution's own, or as you put it, the selection criteria. I think that's a good term for how courses then wind up satisfying those objectives of the core curriculum.
And one of my really basic questions early on was, so how much communication has to be in a course for it to satisfy, to fit into the humanities, to satisfy the humanities component and address what you guys have decided is an essential core objective, which is communication skills?
Yeah, and to complicate it just a bit further, having just come back from several days at AACU's General Ed and Assessment work session, we're really not conceptualizing the foundation area courses as the completion of the core curriculum. We're conceptualizing those as a foundation on which it is built, and communication is a direct example of this. That an individual potentially in a foundation course would learn to recognize audience and voice and that sort of thing, but they would perfect that process of communication in their major, and our intent out of that workshop at least is then to do the assessment at a capstone course that would allow us to see if that foundation actually provided a bridge to be built, to be walked across, or a foundation on which to build, to take that communication further. So, I don't know, it's at the same time balancing the need for folks to transfer in, which is a huge piece of where we are. And it's no easy question, but I would hate for us to believe that we were going to accomplish all of the objectives within the context of a set of specific courses that students would take in the foundation areas alone.
Well, that may be true, but you have to remember, too, I think, that the core curriculum is not designed necessarily to have someone who exits the core with the same level of expertise in communication that someone who majors in communications would have. It's designed to address those things that we think that at a minimum every student, regardless of major, ought to have when they exit the core.
Right. But would expect a higher level of communication from a student in science at the end of their science degree.
Sure.
So that's the piece of it. It's not when you major in the foundation area. It's what you take from those foundation areas into whatever.
Exactly.
I think it's really, I've always found it useful to think of it, as Rex is saying, as kind of a least common denominator across all students, but certainly not the set of exit skills that we expect of any student.
And as we write these, we need to not write them as descriptions of a major, but write them as a description of what is the foundational skills that every course in this component area has got to address.
Right.
Yeah. HDMI, my WPA.
Can I ask another question? In your groups, let's take communication, the communication component. Did you start with the college and career readiness standards, which may not be the highest standards for you guys to start with, but that's just a question. Because my thought is that at the very least, your communications component, the description of the communications component would reflect a ratcheting up of what is the minimum college readiness standards for English and language arts, say.
That's not actually where we started. We started with a look at the current piece that's in the coordinating board standard, and then also looked at a number of different institutions around the nation and their statements in that regard. Did bring the college readiness standards, though, so we can look at them in our group.
We also looked at some of the criticisms of our graduates in higher education where they were deficient, and high among that list were listening skills, oral communication skills, and critical thinking skills. We've addressed critical thinking, and we've mentioned oral communication, and that's one of the areas where we, I think, probably disagree a little bit within our group. It's one thing to say speak across the curriculum. It's another thing not to teach them how to speak before you ask them to speak across the curriculum. So that's where we were.
And I think that's what makes this conversation that we're about to have really important, is when we finalize what the paragraph description of each component area is, we're giving guidance that we'll have to flesh out with value rubrics, with selection criteria, and things of that nature. So it's a really important conversation. But I will say, Bill, if you look at our course objectives map, we have said critical thinking, communication skills are so important. They have to be in every component area. And so we're talking the component area of communication is different than the objective of communication skills. Let's get into our groups. I'll let the chairs of those groups decide where you want to be. We would encourage the visitors to get into a group like you've done previously and to comb through these yourselves.
Be right here.
We're going to give you an hour to read through each one of the areas and kind of bring back what your group would propose a paragraph might look like that represents each area.
And remember to look at the areas that
20 minutes.
you did not create.
20 minutes per each area that you didn't already work on.
That would be terrible.
Christopher, where do you think he's going to go to?
Exceptional and productive, and so I hope that your reports can capture the depth of the conversations that we heard, because I think they were illuminating. We're going to go through the categories, and so we'll start with humanities, and we'll just ask a person from each group to kind of capture what you talked about in reference to humanities, and then what we're going to try to do is if the coordinators for each group have something they have typed up or want to write up and email it to Lucy next week, our work group is going to take what you produced and try to bring it back to you we're not wordsmithing every single sentence for every category today. We'll wait till next time to do that.
This needs to ripen a little bit more.
The next time when you're no longer the chair, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
You're a brilliant man. So let's start with humanities, and which group wants to share your thoughts? Yeah, Shannon, can you share your...
Yes, we liked the definitions a lot in our group and just felt like we might want to see a little more specific language about the knowledge base of humanities and visual and performing arts, because the definitions seem to be broad enough to include just about any course. I mean, you could make a case for so many different courses to fit into there. So a little bit more about what they're supposed to know or learn in the course was what our group recommended.
And I ask other people in my group to please pipe up as well. I just have a few notes. We were struck by some similarities between humanities and social and behavioral sciences that we thought maybe shouldn't exist. We had this notion that the social and behavioral sciences at times were about collective truths, where the humanities were about individual truths. And that we thought...
A lot of truth in it.
Pardon?
There's actually a lot of truth in it.
But we were struck by the notion that the book that changed my life didn't change yours, Rex.
Yeah.
But we thought that might be a part of a definition of humanities that we didn't see in this, and that so often the social and behavioral sciences were about our behaviors and the humanities were about our beliefs. And that was a distinction that spoke to us about that area.
One of the things that also we like about both humanities and visual and performing arts is that they do have a very good format and a style in terms of first saying this component has these expectations or this description, and then the second sentence directs more about what is expected from the students to obtain out of the component, which is very clear out of those. So we discussed these as a possibility of all the description follow similar. And there was also a lot of discussion about that the personal reflection and expression ideas were not in this first description, which is similar to what Michael was discussing.
Okay, the Williamson Group on humanities?
Well, we actually didn't approach that, but we worked on a kind of a formula frame. And so with my group's permission, I'm going to apply our formula to this statement, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but we would have said something along these lines. Through the study of the humanities, students will, and I'm reading back from their page, focus on past and present activity unique to human beings in the way that such activity and products reflect human ideas, experience, and values. The study of humanities engages students in innovative inquiry, analysis, synthesis of information, expand their ability to communicate across cultures, and articulate their social responsibility in a rapidly changing global community. Our formula basically was to kind of take one sentence, as they were saying, that frames very broadly what you would expect of non-majors, really, to do within the context of that course. And the second one is fairly explicit about the areas that we've said need to be covered, which in this case is critical thinking, communication, and social responsibility, which is the one reason we changed that to probably social rather than humanities to keep it.
Okay.
Close?
Yeah. We thought as a template, it simplified things. When we got to the government, when we were trying to come up with ways to word the basic elements we decided need to be in there, we couldn't come up with it. So what we decided, we just need to say these need to be in there and allow the specialists in the discipline to figure out how to work those core components into it. But if they're not specified, then it's too broad. So a content accessible for non-major statement followed by a skill statement that we've agreed have to be a part of that class, and keep it fairly simple, and I hate to call it that, but transparent.
Okay.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. Let's go back to visual and performing arts. Carol Group?
We had the same thoughts on that, that it was really broad. We weren't sure if things like dance, theater, music should or should not be included. I think we just all would like to see just a little more specific language about the knowledge base.
Coleman Group on visual and performing.
I think probably folks have covered our comments in theirs, with the exception that in the last sentence, enable students to think and communicate. We thought we should add critically, creatively, and innovatively. Small change.
Ability to communicate critically and creatively, is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
all three.
All three, critically, creatively, and innovatively, about artistic expression. Throughout international cultures, maybe just across cultures. Not quite sure what that meant. I assume that it's in our own culture, or just across cultures everywhere.
Multicultural.
Yeah. Globally. Yeah.
But without using global.
Give us some group on visual and performing.
Well, that's another one we did there. But so we would suggest the formula.
Same kind of thing. Okay, let's go to in U.S. history, and we'll start with the A group.
Well, we talked about it a long time, and get it up. No.
Talk about that.
One of the things that we talked about in our group, and I think it follows with what the Williamson group talked about, was we felt like there was a need to identify talk about the component area. For example, for us, instead of saying the study of, we would have started it with U.S. history focuses on, but a similar kind of thing where we're talking about in general what the definition is to begin with. So that was one of the things that we would have done. And I think another thing that we thought is that there needed to be there needed to be not quite so much specific information about how it goes about doing it, because we felt like as a core course there was a lot of information in here that was more related to upper level course or a graduate course, or what instructors might do if they were in there. And so as general information, what have I covered what we talked about? Because we didn't come up with a specific result for that one.
Okay.
I think that's an interesting thread that I heard in lots of, is some of these, especially the U.S. and the political science, maybe what a major outcome would be, and we need to refocus on what a general education outcome is.
Okay, Coleman Group on
Yes, and I want to ask everybody to please chime in on this one, and there was a lot of discussion here. I think Jeannie has some stuff on.
Well, not to be repetitive, but that was exactly what the very same sentiment of our group was, that we would start it with the objective of this component is, and then give more of a lens look at it, and then go into, but these are the defined expectations of the students. So we kind of felt that every one of the components ought to have that kind of format. And so we kind of got lost in the words that made it very specific, and the fear that you would have to know exactly how to include every one of those components, and how to, instead of doing it in a broad sense where you could do it in any of the courses. So it wasn't anything specific about the things that are listed as just the format, and doing it as an overview.
I think that the notion across both of them, the notion that it is important to understand how the things that have come before and the ways in which we govern ourselves influence our lives today at a very personal level. And we talked a good bit about the whole notion of the franchise and the privilege and responsibilities that come with being a citizen in this country, in this state, and that we would expect that these courses would touch on both of those. And I suspect that the legislature expects that as well. But that whole notion of exercising your franchise and what it means,
which is included in the government political science ideas too. But one of the things that concerns us when we first read it is that something that we discussed earlier about that this is what it is describes what is expected out of the core curriculum, not as a field of study, right? It seems like this is very comprehensive, includes almost everything here, but it should focus it more on what the core component of history.
History actually starts with this statement as a field of study.
Okay.
I just had one comment or question about a few words in the sixth line down under U.S. history. That last part, the development and the decay of civilization. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what that means. Does that mean the decay of civilization in general, or of a given civilization?
U.S.
Oh, it's U.S. history. It seems a little value-laden.
It's a little broad.
In the Williamson group.
This is one we actually worked on. So, within the context of the study of history, students will gain knowledge about how individuals, institutions, and cultures have interacted at various times and places. Students will analyze the way these interactions have impacted human life in the past and will continue to do so in the future. They will effectively communicate evidence in support of historical ideas and concepts. The acquisition of historical knowledge and skill foster personal growth, professional competence, and civic responsibility.
We didn't think the task of the historian really needed to be in this.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Right, any more than the task of the English teacher.
I agree.
Right, yeah.
This was our first attempt, so we weren't quite so succinct in our formula, but I think
And Rex kept bothering us and tracking.
That's right.
Hovering.
I was just listening. Okay, government, political science, and we'll start with the day group.
Well, we suggested shortening it, I think, and putting it into what was the formula system that we were working with, which is similar to the one that y'all did. Government and political science focuses on consideration of the Constitution of the United States and the constitutions of the states, with special emphasis on that of Texas. It is a study and analysis of the United States government and responsible civic life. Period. Shorter.
Well, and that's what we were just talking about that a minute ago. I mean, essentially the whole idea of franchise and the citizen in society, and not simply a review of government itself, the role of government in the life we live.
In the Williamson group on U.S. government.
Okay, another one we actually did. Students in political science and government will understand the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the states, with a special emphasis on Texas, including the political institutions and philosophical foundations that inform these governments. In learning to analyze the relationship of relationships of civic life, students will gain skills in critical thinking, communication, teamwork, and social responsibility.
I like it. And I'll add my own editorial comment here on government, political science, and U.S. history, for that matter. And I think that both of them probably ought to also address we raised in this report to some extent, and that is the global aspect of this, and make some mention about how students also ought to be taught something about how the U.S. history and then U.S. government and Texas government fits into a broader scheme of the rest of the world, and how we impact that, and then the rest of the world impacts us, and so on. And it's not easy to do within the confines of a U.S. and U.S. government course. I mean, I know as someone who used to teach U.S. government, quite often people would get to those final chapters on foreign policy and that kind of stuff, and it never got there, actually. It never got that far. It's somewhat akin to U.S. history. Oftentimes ends when World War II ended.
Yeah, really.
And that kind of thing, because there's not enough time. In some sense, you don't get enough time to get there. But I do think that's important to understand the place of the United States in a global context.
I just added a phrase in.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so who needs the space age, right? I would also like to toss something into this particular discussion. I had a call from somebody in the Houston Community College administration a couple weeks ago with the interesting news that Houston Community College has won the contract to start a community college system in Qatar.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And that's a pretty interesting responsibility. And the caller was saying that they had been looking at what Texas A&M University is offering at the university complex in Qatar, and was very surprised that there's a straight-ahead 6 hours of American history and 6 hours of government, and wanted to know if there was any way to sort of broaden that a little bit. So we got out the statutes, okay? And we really read the law very carefully with him on the phone with me. And it's interesting to me that the title of the statute regarding history is titled American History. And there's no real content requirement in the statute. But it clearly has to be some aspect of American history. It doesn't say it has to be a survey of U.S. history from the ground up through yesterday. It doesn't say it has to divide at 1865 or 1877. And I know that there is a fair amount of breadth in the history courses that are available if you look at all of the history courses offered across institutions. But it has to have something to do with U.S. history. The government statute just says government and political science. It doesn't say American government. It does have a content requirement that somewhere along the line you have to consider the federal and state constitutions, and especially Texas. And so while I referred the caller to his college's general counsel, because I am not a lawyer, it seemed to me that there might be a way to provide at least some kind of a comparative approach, especially in government, that would allow students who are living in Qatar to fulfill this requirement without actually having to never consider the government they are actually living within. And I don't know whether that makes any difference to any of this discussion, but it's been much on my mind, how much we take for granted. And I think that shows here we all assume that it has to be U.S. government, U.S. political science, and nothing else. And yet if you really read the statute, maybe not.
Was that an accident? However, when the statute was written, did anybody there seriously think we would teach somebody else's government?
I don't know if I was alive when that statute was adopted.
That's most
Sorry.
statutes, but what do you think?
I don't know. I wasn't. Thank you, Lucy.
No, I think you're absolutely right. The assumption behind the statute at the time, anyway, was that it would be U.S. And the legislation on government actually is more explicit because it does explicitly mention the U.S. Texas constitutions. But you're right. I think at the time the notion was that there probably wasn't any other history than U.S. history. I mean, there was other history, but it wasn't important. And stuff.
You know, Michael actually was discussing quite a bit of this because may I rephrase you? You mentioned about the need to this component to address how society needs to understand how society is influenced by the way it's governed or how it is governed. Am I correct? So that is the overarching element here, and then of course you can get specific about which government this is, and also you refer a lot up to the privileges and responsibilities of the citizenship, right? As opposed to just focusing immediately, you have to know the Constitution of Texas and of the United States.
And obviously, legislative intent is really important to understand when you're trying to implement this kind of a statute.
Okay, we are halfway through this discussion, and it is noon. So I suggest we eat lunch and then finish the other half when we come back. All right.
Good plan.
Swallow first?
Swallow and then...
Well, with this one, we got halfway through. And what we thought of beginning it with would be mathematics focuses on quantitative literacy and application of mathematical tools in the solution of problems. And that's as far as we got.
Yeah, but it's good.
But
that's good. That's fantastic.
But that, in terms of what we've talked about before about having our formula and saying, okay, let's begin with a general definition and then move on. We got as far as the general definition in our group with mathematics.
Okay, thank you.
That definition.
The Carroll group, I'm sorry.
We liked the second definition that started with quantitative literacy requires. We thought maybe data representation could be data presentation so that it would be a trigger word that signified communication. And we felt that was what was really missing, was the communication element. And that was all we had.
Okay. And the Williamson group.
But we didn't actually do math either. We didn't do math.
What did you do?
Doesn't do math. Okay.
We did our formula for quite a while, and then we worked it into history and government, trying it out, and did as no problem with the other one. So y'all want to jump in and suggest what?
We'll ask you to work on the developmental math part. Their joke, not mine.
Thanks. Okay, then let's go to life and physical sciences, and we'll start with the day group.
An end.
Okay.
That's as far as we got.
Okay. And the Carroll Group.
Okay, we really liked that last one that was modified from Vanderbilt, but wondered if the last line that says the capacity to distinguish between science and what masquerades as science might be a little bit controversial. So our...
That's how it was Vanderbilt.
Yeah, that's right. They get to do whatever they want, somebody said. Our student member recommended develop the capacity to determine what constitutes science as an alternative.
Repeat that, please.
Develop the capacity to determine what constitutes science.
Good critical thinking component.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting.
We don't want to promote that.
Good diplomacy skills, too.
Yeah.
And the Williamson Group on life and physical sciences?
You know this. You already know the answer to this.
They didn't get that. They're done.
Just wanted to make sure.
Well, at least
Just in the off chance that you'd gotten to more. Oh, we didn't. Yeah, that's okay. All right. So that leaves us then with communication. And we'll start with the day group again.
Well, there was quite a lot of options to choose from, and we spent a very communication considering them all because we thought there were lots of really good things about them all. What we ended up doing was starting with E on the list and then modifying that one. And what we came up with was communication focuses on effective oral, written, and visual modes, recognizing the consequences of communication, using a style appropriate to the subject, occasion, and audience. Competence in expressive and receptive communication empowers students to develop and express ideas, foster understanding, promote change, and work effectively with others. Work effectively is a nice teamwork thing. So basically what we did is we changed it to our formula with something focuses, and then we added work effectively with others at the end in order to incorporate something related to teamwork, which is one of the items in there. And the personal responsibility, we added the phrase about recognizing the consequences of communication as relating to personal responsibility with regard to communication. So that's what we did.
Well, good. Thank you. The Carroll Group.
Okay, we also started with E and felt that adding something about analysis would bring in the critical thinking component and something that dealt with teamwork, possibly individually or within teams as part of the communication. But those two aspects of the objectives seemed to be missing.
Okay. In the Coleman Group.
Well, we also started with E. And we looked at...
I don't like when consensus is in place. So
But we went to
We knew that.
H.
We went to H.
We went to H. And we thought we'd just combine
Let me
them.
rephrase. I like consensus.
And we looked at H, and then we looked at just modifying H. So we said the communication component enables students to clearly and effectively communicate in a variety of modes, including written, oral, and visual, and then the rest of the sentence. We just added those words, written, oral, and visual.
Okay. All right. Then that brings us to the last group, social and behavioral sciences, and the day group will kick us off again.
Okay. Again, lots of choices, and we tried to look through them all and try to pull together what we liked about all of them. But I think we used A and B2, I think, probably as the things we were working with the most. What we came up with was the focus of social and behavioral sciences is to examine, describe, and explain the behaviors and interactions among individuals, groups, institutions, events, and ideas. Such knowledge increases understanding and promotes development of personal and social responsibility. As you notice, everything we did, we made it short.
I like that. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
That's a great thing.
Carol Group.
We also used A in B2. And thought that the last sentence of B would work well with A. The one concern that our group had was that it was very difficult to differentiate between the differences in social and behavioral sciences and humanities. They seem very closely related in description. We didn't know how to fix it, but
well, I think we probably all agree with that. And what's interesting is, in the current format, humanities and social and behavioral sciences are all lumped together, and aren't they?
No,
they're
separate categories.
Humanities and visual performing arts.
Oh, humanities. Okay.
Yeah, those are grouped together.
I think the clarification of the differences between the two will really help us at an institution level figure out what's supposed to be included and what's not.
And that's what we were talking about earlier with our statement on humanities, too, is that, actually Agnes brought it up, that we needed a little bit more substance in there to clarify what would fall under that category to differentiate it from this area.
I think there's some general confusion there that may have been ongoing, because if you have noticed in the ACGM, there is at least one course that is cross-listed with one title of, I think it's humanities, and then it's exactly the same course definition that is in, I think, anthropology, which is identified as a social science in the ACGM. So I don't think this question is one that is just cropped up.
Well, we're presuming these are discrete categories to begin with, and history is just kind of, they've been glumps of activity that kind of found themselves together.
Yeah. I mean, as much as we create our, organize our colleges along supposedly very discrete disciplinary lines, the reality is that there's much more overlap than we generally recognize or sometimes even wish to recognize. Okay, so the Coleman Group on social and behavioral sciences.
Okay, we did some combination of A and C and then actually put some words in ourselves. The objective of the social and behavioral science component of a core curriculum is to increase students' knowledge of how social and behavioral scientists discover, describe, and explain, and here's our words, the behavior of individuals and how they are influenced by the context and culture in which they develop. Then we went to C. Through this component area, students gain an understanding of human action and interaction with individual, group, and societal behavior and the impact of humanity on the larger world.
Very good. I like that.
Okay. One point I would like to make, I just noticed this, depending on which description you look at, in some cases the description focuses on how the expert in the discipline views the world.
Yeah.
And then in other cases the description focuses on what the student is supposed to gain.
Yeah, we're going to have to build some consistency there. And I think what we're trying to do...
Well, I just think it's a delicate dance between providing signposts and shackles. And I think we just have to be very careful not to over-specify at this level of reduction exactly what we're doing, but to provide sufficient models. I mean, this is a very broad landscape between across higher education in Texas, and it's a little bit difficult to have one description that fits everybody and has, at the same time, the level of specificity that does provide direction, but doesn't provide constraints. It's hard to do. Recognizing that's true doesn't make it any easier to do.
And I think that is a fine line that we need to be very careful about. It sort of goes back to my statement earlier about making sure that we give the institutions the kind of flexibility they need to implement this stuff and teach it, assess it and evaluate it in the way that fits their institution and their mission, while at the same time providing some guidance that's going to serve students across the board, no matter where they wind up or where they go. And you're right, that is a very delicate balance that we'll have to be constantly aware of as we work our way through this.
My mathematics faculty was very comfortable in fully specifying what students needed, but it was pages long. It was a checklist rather than a description.
Well, I was going to say that in the dances, whether to put all those components or if we try to use our objectives and you put the same objectives on the end of every one of them, then they all sound just alike. And we had discussion way back about whether who's our audience to read this. Is it faculty? Is it students? And sometimes neither one of them know what the core is really about. So we want both to understand something from this, not just all these theoretical words
That's a really good.
that are on
that's
every
a good,
one of our
that's good.
objectives.
Well, that said, are you ready to vote? I think what we've got clear on in the course of the process is if in pulling together the objectives, we had a work group that tried to take what the committee had discussed for 2 or 3 meetings and bring something back, and I think we're going to use that same model here. Otherwise, each meeting would be dedicated. We would have 8 meetings because we would take a whole meeting to delineate wordsmith humanities. So at the next meeting, we'll try to have something that we can react to, and we'll pull from the groups that have created these definitions and try to reflect what the discussion has been today, which I don't know about you, it may not have been productive for you, but it was so insightful and invigorating to hear the conversations that you were having, and I was honored to eavesdrop on them.
Russell, I think it might be helpful to talk just a little bit, maybe that's because it's our predilection, about the formula.
Well, I'll talk about that in a second.
Because I think the formula is really important. But I think what we want to talk about now philosophically for a few minutes, as a group, we need to get clear on as we draft these into a specific proposal, what we think the purpose of these descriptions is. What do you think the purpose of these descriptions should be?
In following the spirit of that, if I may ask a question, how much do we need to think about assessment as we develop these descriptions, and whether or not something is actually accessible?
Well, I think the assessments, you can correct me if I'm wrong, assessment gurus, the assessments are specific to the 6 objectives.
Right.
And I mean, we, in including and writing them, have ways and models, multiple ways to assess those. I don't think that we have to get specific on assessing these individual descriptions.
Okay. All right.
Or writing it into the definition.
Yeah.
Or writing the assessments into it. I think we do need to be cognizant of the fact that at the end of the day, the institutions will be expected to assess and evaluate these things in some fashion. And so in that context, I think we do need to be aware of making sure that whatever we put into them is accessible in some fashion, how the institutions decide to do that. And I think that's as far as we need to go with it. Celia, and then Juan.
And to clarify a little bit on that, we've gone through the process of kind of suggesting where these would fall in individual courses. But I'm understanding that the individual institution will decide where they're going to assess those outcomes. We know that we're going to try to weave them in this way, but the assessment might not be course by course in that. The idea is that the institution determines how they know that the curriculum meets those outcomes, however it decides to do it.
Yeah, and in that sense, I think the committee from the very outset has always tried to focus on being able to use information for the coordinating board and for SACS. And while SACS wants us to assess and evaluate gen ed outcomes, they leave it to the institution to figure out how you're going to do that and where you're going to do it, and you can do that in a variety of ways. So, Juan, and then...
Can I respond to that just before, because
oh, sure.
You deal with the assessment aspect, Juan?
Somehow, but go ahead.
if the students are staying in the same institution, assessing at the end makes sense. But when you have students transferring in from every place, trying to assess the core at the completion, it's really hard to figure out where the gapes are, where the holes are. So in a sense, as you divide classes, you almost have to figure out how you assess whether that class in itself is meeting those goals.
Yes and no. I mean, I think institutions can tackle that and answer that individually as institutions. And it may be that an institution determines that the courses are the best place to do that assessment. But I think there may be other ways that institutions may choose to do it.
Okay, let's be clear that assessment is discovering whether that institution's students in the aggregate, and you're not necessarily having to do it for all students. It can be a random sample, whatever sample it is, that they are able to accomplish those objectives. So don't look at it as an evaluation. Look at it as an assessment, that the institution is making sure that that institution is accomplishing those objectives.
And if they're not, where they go? If the answer is no, that they're not accomplishing that goal, what does the institution do?
They're going to have to, and again, it goes back to the institution, because the institution has many options on how they can determine what the problem is and what therefore needs to be adjusted.
We have 60% of our students being transferred, especially in the core. And we find at the end that, okay, the students aren't able to do these skills. Where do we go wrong? And we're trying to figure out which classes are not effective. Now, I call it assessment or evaluation. They both come into play at that point to answer that question.
Well, and it may be that you find that, okay, it's the transfer students, or you have a question, is it our transfer students that are causing us to have this problem? Or is it because we're starting at a lower level with our native students' problem? So you're beginning to ask those questions, where is the problem occurring? And then what choice you have in correcting the problem is going to be dependent on where's the problem happening, what population. So you may have different ways to go about it, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. I just think that if you do that, it's a quick way just to avoid taking responsibility for it. Because you say, it's somebody else's problem. It's the old, the high schools aren't doing the work. It's not because we're not doing the job, because they're not coming prepared. Same thing here. It's our transfer students, so nothing wrong with our...
But your assessment person has got to be really clear on how they're designing your assessment and who they're assessing and knowing who they're assessing. Because what you may find is... what an institution that I'm really close to found is that the students that transferred in were doing better than our native students. Well, that changed the conversation, because it was easy to say it's those transfers. When we got real on assessment, we found otherwise.
And when you pointed that out, you now are looking for another job? Is that...
It's your cause-effect relationship.
Is there anything that would stop an institution from doing both? In other words, you get two different kinds of information.
I think you'd have
to. You assess at the end of a class, you get one kind of information. If you assess in the aggregate, you get another. If you do a study back and break it down, how many were transfers, find out where they transferred from, and we can always slander that school. So there's so many possibilities.
But I think the key is that the institutions have flexibility to design their own assessment plan.
As long as that, when it's all said and done, it is an honest, accurate assessment. And I think what Richard is saying is it's not going to be honest and accurate unless we can break it down more than a standardized test at the end with transfers not being delineated.
And I think SACS is going to have you look at it that way also. We just went through SACS and we got hammered on assessment. And you got to look at it at multiple levels, including what Richard's talking about.
Juan, you had a comment.
Well, I was trying to answer Russell's questions about what was the reason that we were trying to find the descriptions. And the way I see it is that the word that keeps appearing in all the descriptions, the word focus. And so we're trying to find out which are all those areas and focus on those areas, so there's a very clear delineation of those areas, and as little overlap as possible. For example, we had a discussion about humanities and social sciences that Catherine helped us a lot about, and only when those areas are very clearly delineated, then you'll be able to develop objectives about those areas, and then from the objectives you develop the assessment tools, which is obvious. I'm just probably stating the obvious here. I am stating it. So with the purpose that across institutions, the assessments will be less diverse and more clearly established.
Pam, because we're recording, if you could go to the podium and because we're recording, tell us who you are and where you're from.
Go ahead and just start speaking.
Okay, Pam Matthews, Texas A&M University. This is a genuine question from the outsiders because I haven't been privy to all of your conversations. Is the main goal to redescribe the Corps as we have it, or is the main goal to introduce all the new outcomes that you guys have been talking about now? Because to me, if we're just going to redescribe the things and put into each one of them that grid with all of its outcomes, we're right back at the EEOs, and I don't really see what difference it is. So it's a genuine question. I mean, I feel like for our institution, I kind of need to know what the real goal is. Does that make sense?
I think the goal, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, because I often am, I think the goal is we already have the objectives for the Corps, but we're executing those objectives through the foundational component areas, and we're wanting to give some guidance as to what courses fit into those component areas.
Okay. So just, a fan of your outcomes, by the way. I really like the way they've been shaping up, so I was just curious. I just came back from AAC&U. Celia was there, too, and the conversation there is so much about not segregating Gen Ed, our core, apart from the rest of it. So, just a kind of a context, because that was a really helpful conversation for me. So thanks, that helps.
Sure.
Pam, you might want to know, as one outsider to another, that the question that you just raised came up in our shop this week several times. So we're also asking that question.
Okay, that's great. I mean, I when I first saw that list of outcomes, as all of you have been working on, I was so excited and thought, great, we'll have a core, but what we're really going to do is focus on getting students to these outcomes. And so, so there's my excitement about the whole thing.
Well, and Pam, I would say, since you haven't been privy to the conversation to this point, as a committee, we're working on a two-phase process. Phase one is to figure out how we can revitalize the Corps under the current statutory framework. Phase two might have recommendations that require statutory change, and it might have the same outcomes, but the structure of it might look very different.
Got it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Let's mention one more thing about assessment that I think reinforces your notion. I think anytime that assessment occurs at a level beyond the single class, then one has to ask the question about the level of exposure. Now, in places like the Austin campus, where 95% of the folks are native students, then you can expect probably when they graduate they have been exposed to all that represents the core curriculum or the core competencies that people are expected to have by the time they graduate. At Dallas, probably half of the new students each year are transfer students. They come in different parts of the process, having had exposure, by and large, to a core curriculum somewhere in Texas, but many different flavors and many different pieces. So it's a little bit difficult to know. One of the things that we've done is make a decision. We've been so happily involved in the collegiate learning assessment now for 6 years, and we do it only with our native freshmen. And so when those people are seniors, then those are the only folks that take that assessment, because those are the folks that we guarantee have been through the entire experience. And the thousands of transfer students we have are never a part of that assessment. So I think those kinds of things, it would have to be very difficult to tease out the proportionate contribution of you've had this much of our core and that much of somebody else's, and our math and their science. And I think that any kind of assessment of everyone in an institution that has a lot of transient students is going to be incredibly complicated to do when it exists beyond the level of the individual class, where you can say, you had that class, you did not.
But the key to what you said is that your institution has their own plan for how they assess it.
And that's
I think
the point
that's
I wanted
what
to make.
we're talking about, is the institutions have an obligation and an opportunity to develop this in a way that they see fit. That's what we're recommending. Now, who knows what in a legislative session that has no money to dole out, what might happen to us. But I think our perspective is to allow maximum freedom for institutions to own this. And the way Sam Houston does it may look different than the way UT Dallas does it.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding the purpose of this group. Just like we don't want people to look at it from a territorial standpoint, I don't think we need to look at it as an institution, but what are we doing for the state of Texas to say that people are getting degrees from us, come out with this? And if we don't take into account the transfers, there's a huge segment that we're not addressing. You know, we're not answering the question for the state, are we providing a decent education?
Two things. One, I don't want this to denigrate into an assessment conversation, although it's an important conversation to have. But I think you're misunderstanding what I'm arguing. I think we've got to assess transfers. But if UT Dallas, the way they assess their students might be different than the way you do. I'm not of the proponent that this committee should suggest how everyone assess these 6 learning outcomes. I think we offer options, we offer resources, we offer training, and the key is that we are assessing that graduates, in whatever form that is, have these 6 competencies fulfilled. And that's probably going to require course assessments, programs assessments, end of experience assessments, but I don't want to prescribe, I don't think this committee wants to prescribe what that should look like. I know how to kill a conversation, don't I?
I just thought that part of the reason why we're making changes to the core is to address just these very issues where we know that students in Texas transfer and that because the core is different everywhere, we're trying to make it more uniform, so it wouldn't matter if they transferred, you know, that they would have the same objectives met in whatever institution they're going to.
I can tell you that when Senate Bill 148 passed in 1997, that was the senator's goal that he stated. Phil Bivens pretty much articulated just what you said. And I think Dick's point about how the state-level initiative meshes with the institutional initiative to provide general education, I think is a really germane one. And it's a difficult one. And I think you're right, Dick. The purpose of this committee, with all of its institutional representatives and all the different sectors represented, that's really why you're in the room. And you know, we don't have easy answers. If the staff understood all this stuff, we'd just do it. You all could have a nice life and it would all work. But, you know, we really need the input that you have, and that's why having these difficult conversations is so important to us. I think Kevin said something during the break to this effect, that this is just so important to hear, and the process is important.
Russell, how far into this process are we going? Are we going down to the assessment level at some point? Are we going to say that these are the things that need to be assessed? Where are we stopping? Because when we're having discussions, we're talking about how generic we're going to make, like, these statements. Well, if the statements are so generic, who defines what the assessment criteria is going to be for these generic statements then? Or should the statements be more robust, because it could be anybody defining these at an institution?
Yeah.
Well, let me throw out one question before you answer. Okay. I know you have the right answer. The question that I ask, and that maybe you should ask yourselves, is to what extent is the Texas core curriculum overlap with the general education requirement of SACS and how you build your assessment to satisfy SACS? I think they should be as aligned as possible. We don't want you to do something for the state that is completely different from what you do from SACS.
Okay, let me try to answer your question. And I think this goes also to not only the purpose of trying to revitalize the core, but also goes to what the purpose of defining these foundational components is as well. The little chart we have that have all the X's and stuff on it, remember why we created that in the first place, and the idea behind that was that if we could ensure somehow that within those foundational component areas certain objectives were met, then a student could go from institution A to B to C, even to D, and carry with them different courses from the core curriculum across 2 or 3 or 4 institutions. But because we had tried to build in some assurance that they had gotten at least these objectives in these component areas, that when they transferred, they would carry them with them, and that they would actually get, we hope, but I think we can get pretty close, that by the time they finish that 42-hour core, they would actually have all of those objectives, regardless of the institution that they got them in. And so that's the first purpose of drawing up that table. And then the conversation today, what I've heard about the foundational components is and I think the purpose of them is then to give institutions some guidance in 2 areas. One is what courses wind up being in that foundational component area, and then what kind of objectives, if you will, do they have to meet to be in that component area. And I've also heard 2 things about this, and one is that each of these definitions should give some very broad-based, but it should give some subject matter content to it. In other words, there should be some definition of what is the humanities, and I think the conversation about humanities and social and behavioral sciences really points that out. That if we want to consider them as separate foundational component areas, and we want to attach to them different, sometimes overlapping, but at the same time different objectives, then there also ought to be some difference between the 2 areas, the 2 component areas itself. And so part of what we needs to come out of this is some guidance to institutions about what kind of courses go into the humanities area versus what kind of courses go into the social and behavioral sciences area, for example. What kind of courses, and I use the term courses pretty loosely here because I don't want to tie this to some sort of discipline and course rubric scheme. Well, if it's social and behavioral sciences, then it must be one of the 5 recognized social sciences for the past 100 years, and the one recognized behavioral science for the past 50 years, and so on. And so you've got those issues, and then the other piece of this that the working group will try to work out and then bring back to you is the notion of then how do you specifically write into that description, or explicitly write into it rather, the connection to those core objectives itself. And what I heard is that almost everybody made some attempt to do that. I mean, there was a lot of work done on what does it mean to be in the humanities component area? What does it mean to be in the life and physical sciences component area to begin with? And then how do you explicitly tie those things to the objectives that we've put into that little chart? And I think as a practical matter, then the purpose of all of that is to provide some guidance to institutions about what kind of courses then can then be a legitimate part of the core curriculum in each one of those component areas. And if all of that matches up, then the students, then to go back to the original purpose of this, which was to, not only to simplify and also revitalize the core curriculum, but also remember we've always talked about how is it that we best serve students out of all of this. And so that when that 70% or the 50% of students that transfer, when they come to you, there's some assurance that they've actually had those objectives. Now, all of this assumes they got them in Texas somewhere. It assumes they got them at a public institution in Texas somewhere. But that is, by and large, usually that's the vast majority of transfers. And so we can ensure that they have met those objectives. And personally, what I don't want to see is then out of that then comes just another listing of exemplary, the EEOs again. Because I think, and this is personal opinion about this, but I think the subject matter content of those courses, that's really a disciplinary function. That's a disciplinary and program function that needs to go on. And the departments need to talk about what the content of those courses need to be within some very broad parameters defined by things like the academic course guide manual and that sort of thing. But otherwise, that content needs to be really defined by the institutions themselves and the departments and the disciplines that deal with them. And not by this committee or by the coordinating board.
But this committee plays into that with these 6 objectives. We're not getting into a content-specific conversation, right, but we're saying how you deliver the content and the outcome of that content's got to tackle these 6 objectives. And that's a big shift.
Yeah, and it's those 6 general education objectives, not necessarily content-specific objectives.
But we shouldn't fool ourselves in thinking that these 6 objectives are going to be operationalized the same at every institution. If we allow them that freedom, then we cannot say, and I'm not speaking against, that concept, but we cannot say then, as you said earlier, that then all the students in the state of Texas we're going to be able to assume have the same sort of experience in these objectives, because they won't. Because critical thinking skills are going to be defined differently at my institution than it is at another institution. So we're not going to end up in the state of Texas with a core that is the same throughout the state of Texas. We're going to end up with objectives that are defined by individual institutions. So we can't make the argument that it's going to be the same experience wherever they take it.
I didn't make the argument that it would be the same experience. What I was trying to argue is that we can at least ensure that every student has had a course or some experiences that address, at least in broad terms, the notion of written and oral communication skills. That is addressed in some sense quantitative skills. I'm not arguing that they should have the same experience by any means.
Isn't that where we are now?
That's not even going to happen inside an institution when you go from one English 1301 to another English 1301 that the students are going to have.
But isn't that where we are now, and doesn't that kind of figure into some of Dick's concern about the fact that it's not the same from one institution to another institution, and you get students that are transferred, and then if they find that they're not...
Just want to ask Larry, did you say that the definition of critical thinking skills will be different from one institution to another?
Yes. Because we just say that you have creative thinking, innovation, inquiry, analysis, evaluation, and synthesis. And I would say that at every institution around this table, that's going to be defined differently and operationalized differently at every institution.
And the change is we're actually talking about critical thinking, whereas before you could or could not deal with it, you could or could not address it. There's at least some movement that unifies the conversation, even if we don't have exact agreement on what the definition is. But I don't think we want exact agreement on the definition, because then we open ourselves up to having one standardized test that we all of our students have to pass to demonstrate critical thinking.
But wasn't critical thinking in the original document? It was one of the original elements of the core. Or what did they call it?
When the survey was done of the institutions, it was not one necessarily that was being done by all institutions.
No, but it's originally in the core, Catherine.
It was originally one of the basic intellectual competencies.
Intellectual competencies.
Now,
critical thinking was. It was there. In fact, most of these.
But if you could tell me how any institution integrated those intellectual competencies in a practical way, I think we ignored them.
I think this kind of discussion has been real helpful. I think it's the sort of thing that's iterative. that we will struggle with it a while. I think it would be good for us to go back to the agenda, try to work on that, and this kind of thing I think we're going to have to take about 6 or 7 loops around this block before we get there. But I think maybe we've done it once and we should go to the agenda.
Don't you think we're having some problems, though, in the sense you don't want to dictate and micromanage for individual institutions, but you do want some level of standardization that we can assess but can't assess because of transfers, et cetera, et cetera. We don't want to tell them how to assess. They can do it individually. They can do it as a group. You think we're better now by talking about critical thinking this way and putting it in our template than we were when it was in the general purpose statement but not measured. Some people argue that we weren't doing it then, and I'm not sure why they'll do it now if it doesn't have teeth. So there are some things here your argument to me, Russell, is we're going to be better, not we're going to get it all done. And I would like to add, because I agree with that, I'd like to add to that, though, to me this starts a process. You had the last core for 10 years. All right. Now, what I don't like about the last 10 years, at the end of every year, we didn't reassess core. And we didn't look at what we could do to make it better, and so forth and so on. If you don't want to fall prey to that in the next decade, then if whatever we pass here, there needs to be an annual or semi-annual review. They need to look at it, see what we're doing, if we need to make some changes, if the coordinating board needs to instruct generally on what critical thinking is and offer some insights into that, those kinds of things.
I think that's a helpful point.
But we're not happy with what we did. Now, I want to make this as good as we can, but I don't know that we can do everything that we're talking about at the table, so we need to kind of carve out an area that's doable and then move from there.
Great point.
I think that somehow answers your initial question, Russell, in terms of what we're doing this. It goes back, I think Rex was also pointing out to the same idea. We're getting there. We're not there. Eventually, pointed out to a certain direction about what critical thinking skills are. But at least it confines us to at least to a region, that can eventually develop other means to assess by the institution. Will there be total freedom to do this?
And when we turn in our core report to the coordinating board, as I understand it, if this is passed by the coordinating board, the report will reflect our assessments of these 6 objectives. And previously, our reports of the core to the coordinating board and their approval wasn't based upon that kind of information or data or conversation.
Let me ask a question. When the statewide implementation of the core curriculum under which we are now all operating was implemented about 12 years ago, it was an every 5 years report to the coordinating board, but part of what we expected was that the institution would be collecting data at least annually, would be collating it, would be evaluating it, and forming a plan for how to use it. And those were really elements we wanted to see in the every 5 years report, as well as information about how you expected to use the results of this particular snapshot in time. And I think Lucy and James Goman, a colleague of ours, and I have been very engaged recently in trying to determine how we can review the core curriculum reports that a number of institutions sent to us in May, because we want to get some response back out to you. And what we're trying to do is look at them and develop a normative process for us to use so that we're reviewing these reports appropriately and consistently. And what I'm noticing in the reports I'm reading is a lot of institutions are saying, well, we told you we had a plan, but guess what? We ignored it. And we didn't really do much consistent evaluation until last year when we realized we needed to send you a report. Or it didn't work, so we changed it in the following way, but it took us a while to do that. So, Bill, my question to you would be, I don't think coordinating board staff have the time availability to review over 100 core curriculum reports annually. Do you think it would be appropriate for the UEAC to take that on? Like the DEAC, does some review of distance education programs? Or is there a way that, now we're on an every 10-year report that's supposed to accord with your SACS review cycle? Should I assume that for SACS, you have 7 fallow years, lean years, where you're not doing much, and then you kind of wake up and realize, oh, SACS is coming to town soon, and we better get busy?
Let me make 3 suggestions to that.
I'm at a
Number one
loss.
is, no matter who does it, if somebody doesn't do it, the institutions won't comply. That's a reality. So whether UEAC has the people, coordinating board has the people, if you don't have somebody that contacts them with some regularity and a deadline, they won't do it. So if we're counting on them doing it as a key ingredient to solving this problem, we will never solve this problem. So somebody must take that responsibility. Not my pay grade. Somebody must take it.
Mine either.
Number 2. All right. In my mind, 5 years is way too long. It doesn't give you enough time to get some things done. A 5-year-old bad habit is much harder to correct than a 3-year-old bad habit. So if we've got a decade between these assessments, 10 years, I think it ought to be done every 3 years. And I think the institutions have to be brought in at the top. I think the presidents of institutions, chancellors of institutions need to be brought on board with this, as opposed to moving from the bottom up. If you do that, then you'll get information you need. If you don't do that, you won't get information you need, and in 10 years we'll have another 15 people speculating about what we can do with the platitudes. Sid?
I really appreciate what Kevin said earlier about we don't want to do at the state coordinating board level the same thing that SACS is trying to do and end up at cross purposes with each other and that sort of thing. I also think that the conversation around assessment is helpful, but I think that it is one we'll have to revisit, and we will revisit in a more refined way as we do. I still think it'd be good for us to go back to the agenda and move forward with that, and then revisit this again as we go along. I think when we get to the end of the day, we may have some more clarity where we want to go.
I believe the question that started this discussion was what the foundational component areas.
What do you think their purpose should be?
What should their purpose be? And
the description, the definition.
Yeah, the description.
And I'm kind of confused on that, Russell, just to be honest with you. At first, I thought these foundational component areas were going to be more specific and spell out more of what we were looking for. At the last meeting, that was kind of disabused from me. And I think that's one reason why I went into the whole discussion of the communication component area I didn't know where we were going with it. And another problem is...
I think that's why we're having this conversation. I don't think any of us had clarity on what we need to talk about, what's its purpose.
But I think we worked out a formula in our group when we were talking that works for me. I don't know if it works for everybody else.
For me too.
And that is a general statement and then some specific statements about still general, about what is expected to happen in that foundational component area.
And if I can just add the way that I see it, because I'm all messed up too until I get to one way of looking at it, is that the foundation components are the knowledge. These 6 objectives are what we want the students to be able to do, the skills, when they learn something out of these components. So with that framework, then I can think a little bit clearer. Because otherwise, especially the word communication and the skills, communication skills, those two mess me up because to me it's the same word. But if you look at one as what you're going to learn, one that what you're going to be able to do, then it helps us.
And that's why we kind of went with the formula that if it was on that chart, I can't find my chart to point to. If it was on this chart, it should show up in that foundational component area somewhere in the description. So that you had a kind of, but it had to be, for example, communication is in all those. But communication has got to be tied to the specific area. So you communicate about history, or you communicate about mathematics, or communicate about life sciences, or you do critical thinking in life sciences or critical thinking in mathematics, not just general communication or general critical thinking, but it's tied specifically to that specific area or foundational component.
Very simple if you make it two statements. A is content or disciplines, B are skill acquisitions. And the skill acquisitions are directly off your chart, so there's no doubt what people are talking about. And it's as simple as it can be. Some of these are really poetic, but I'm not sure they're accessible.
I think I would like to advocate for, one, a statement that is student view, so that we look at not what faculty want or what, but that we really say this is the student view. So students will, as a kind of introductory, that we look at it as what would happen for non-majors, if you will. In other words, we don't want to go into the depth that an individual would spend their entire studies in. This is what we expect across the board. So non-majors in this area would be expected for this. So that level of depth. And then a clarity again about which of these course component areas objectives we would expect to occur, so that we have transferability. So to me, those kinds of three elements would be what I would suggest as an important piece of that.
That formula, though, that we were talking about kind of breaks down when you get into communication here. Because then you've got communication having communication skills. And it gets circular. At some point, we've got to say what we mean by communication skills. And I think the place to do that is here, in the foundational component area. Because otherwise, you're just saying, you're defining communication as communication. So you've got to somewhere say what specific communication skills you mean.
In our group discussion, we talked about there needs to be a definition somewhere in this area that defines the purpose of the core objectives and then defines the component areas so people can delineate between the two. Because we started off the discussion trying to figure out which was which and how to make all this work as well. And I know Celia wants us to stay away from assessment, but at some point we need to figure out how it ties into this. Because how we write these foundational areas, we need to know what the assessment piece is going to be, what we're going to expect, or is the institution just going to take it?
I agree with that, and we that's when we have the two assessment accountability people as a part of the conversation and group, because they've helped us define the objectives based on what was accessible and what was available to assess.
I apologize for coming in late, but I'm catching up. I thought I heard somebody at one point say we'd be assessing these foundational definitions. And I got nervous when I heard somebody say that. Okay.
We clarified that we're going to assess the core objectives.
Right.
We're not assessing the foundational definitions.
Very good.
Just a direct follow-on to Lorraine's comment. Pardon me? Yeah, I'm Valerie Payton, Vice Provost of Planning and Assessment for Texas Tech. And I would beg you to not include student learning outcomes in your foundational descriptions, your component descriptions. So you have to be very careful about that, because it's real easy, for instance, in communication to get into knowledge, awareness, and skills. However, you have a very fine set of objectives. But those objectives are going to be challenging enough in the way that you've embedded several in the component areas for us to design authentic assessment and valid assessment. And so if we start, I think those foundations need to be descriptions of the content matter related to that foundation component area. And then your objectives stand alone. And frankly, if you could have something as streamlined as that, instead of all the embedded narrative that we had under the basic assumptions, which included ethics and technology and global view and all this stuff that we then had to follow up on, it would be really nice. It'd be lovely. We'd have communication, we'd have your objective, and we'd have your foundation description. Then let the institutions go, well, we want to build further definition in student learning outcomes. Lorraine's going to the same place, paranoia, that I'm going, but I would beg for kind of a simple model.
could just add, we were having this discussion earlier when we were thinking about some of these definitions, and it's not necessarily that in institutional assessment we would go to every single discipline and assess communication from an institutional perspective differently. From an institutional perspective, we might do a large communications assessment, but our real job is to make sure we include students from all of the different disciplines, and then, line that back out and feed that information back to departments. That might be a way to do it, not necessarily that we're going to go do a different kind of communications assessment in every single area. Because the point at the end is a core point, that students can communicate effectively in the way we described in our core objective.
Well, I think that what the conversation proves to this point is that whatever path we go down, assessment is going down that path with us, and we will rehash some of these same comments at every single meeting, because they're interchangeable. You can't have the conversation about one without the conversation with the other. But at some point, we will have assessment rubric suggestions for the core objectives, because that's why these people are here to help us do that. Are we ready to move on?
Okay. Well, I know I am. I don't know about everybody else, but I think we do need to move on. There's at least a couple of even more contentious topics
now we get to the fun stuff
to take up before the afternoon is over. I would like to remind each of the group leaders to send in to Lucy the comments on both, if you have any additional comments on both your own areas, but also the comments that were made on the other areas that you looked at. And then the working group will try to compile those and come up with some foundational component descriptions that we can bring back to the next meeting and rip those to shreds.
Especially those of you who wordsmithed particular descriptions or who had particular formulas that you'd like to see employed. The more specificity you can send to Lucy and also to me. I'm only going to be out a week, and then I'll be back. And we won't leave her alone with all this. That will really help us to process that and then eventually turn it back around to you so you can think about it just a little more before our next meeting.
Can you give us a deadline?
Wednesday, if you wouldn't mind. And if you need through Friday, that's absolutely fine too. But Wednesday would be lovely. Catherine's out next week.
Wednesday's my birthday, so
we love Lucy.
Yes, Catherine has a very special birthday this year, so we need sure to be seeing before we leave. That's a requirement of being on UEAC.
Make sure you come up and see my office.
Awesome.
I'll show you what they did.
Well, now we get to have the fun conversation. Semester credit hours. It is mandated by the state that we have a minimum of 42-hour core, and it could be up to 48.
Well,
go to that next one.
It's a minimum of 42, and there's a provision in the statute that says any institution that wants a core curriculum with a different number of hours has to have permission from the coordinating board to do so. When we started approving core curricula, the board said, how many of these are we going to get? And we said, don't know. So they decided that we should automatically approve core curricula up to 48 credit hours. That's an additional 6 if they are in compliance with all the other requirements for the core. But any institution that wants a core curriculum of 49 credit hours is going to have to jump through a whole lot of hoops. And guess what? No one has asked that in 12 years, so that's fine.
I was going to say, what percentage of the institutions now have a 42-hour core? Is that up here?
It's up there.
Right up there.
Lucy has...
It's a lovely chart.
Collated this. It's quite beautiful, and you will see that 74 or 75%, about 75% of all public institutions have a core curriculum between 42 and 44 credit hours. I think there's been a lot of change to the number of credit hours in the last few years since the 120 semester credit hour limit on baccalaureate degrees came in. A lot of universities reduced their cores because it was a bargaining strategy with majors that were going to have to cut. So we're seeing a real consistency around the lower end of this scale. And we need to think hard as we are making recommendations about components and credit hours about whether the recommendations would in fact suggest loading more than 42 credit hours into a core curriculum. I suspect that nobody wants to make it impossible for an institution to offer a 42 credit hour core. We don't want to make it a situation where everybody has to offer more than that. Evan, you have anything to add?
Yep. Okay, go to the... Okay. And this is the topic of discussion, which is agenda item 2A, I guess, right?
Yes, this is the one we thought would be difficult.
And it may be. We just, well, we haven't even started yet, so this could be even more contentious. What the chart reflects is sort of the current reality of things, and that is that what we're calling foundational components now basically has 36 hours in it. Under the old scheme, that would have been called Chart 1. And then what we're now have referred to as the institutional component, and feel free to suggest any changes to the name of these things that you would like to see, is that other 6 hours that has traditionally been in Chart 2. Now, there's nothing in legislation beyond a 42-hour minimum. The current Chart 1 and Chart 2 is a creation of the previous core curriculum committees and so forth. And so that can be changed. And then that additional component down there is the 1 to 6 semester credit hours that allows an institution to go from 42 to 48 and so on. So go ahead and go to the next. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Recall that we took the current Chart 1 and we sort of further broke it down into what is current practice, and that's what this chart reflects. And that is that communication is 6 hours, 3, the life and physical sciences is 6, humanities is 3, visual and performing arts is 3, and then U.S. history and government and so forth reflects the 6 hours of each is mandated by a legislative requirement. And then social behavioral sciences is that other social behavioral sciences requirement that you see in a lot of core curricula, which makes up 36 hours. Now again, Chart 1 and Chart 2 are not mandated by legislation. So this committee then has the opportunity to make recommendations about the changes to those charts. Want to add hours to what is there, and you can see this example only. We sort of base this on what current practice, widespread current practice is, and so this is something else that the committee needs to address and think about: is do we want to change that those semester credit hour requirements within those component areas? Yes.
As a math and science institution, we're required, we've made the decision to take the extra 6 hours from Chart 2 and add them to science and mathematics, which we just felt that we had to do. The 36 hours here, 1/3 of it is legislative mandate. And I would guess that if I polled my faculty about a reorganization, it would be to provide fewer hours in history and government, and take those degrees of freedom and spread them elsewhere across the core curriculum.
And there was a bill proposed in the last legislative session that would have done that, but it didn't go anywhere.
The way this first 36 hours of the core evolved was that staff and your predecessor core curriculum committee understood that there needed to be breadth across a variety of different content areas. And so the original proposal that committee fielded was a flexible range in each component area. And when that was presented to the commissioner, he said, "Where's 42 hours?" And the committee chair said, "Well, you mix and match to get your 42." And he said, "I don't see the number 42 on this chart." And so he sent us back to the drawing board. And what this chart represents is the lower number of each of those ranges that were originally proposed. So this is sort of the minimum that was originally considered to represent appropriate distribution across content areas. And then that left 6 credit hours left over to decide what to do with to get up to 42. And somehow that was more acceptable, so that's what we went with. You all don't have to stick with that. You could prescribe the entire 42. You could switch things around. You could change these foundational component areas, and then we'd start all over again with the descriptions.
One of the things we start off with is focusing on how easy it is for students to transfer credits. And one of the biggest areas I see here is in the area of the sciences, where we require 8 hours, not 6 hours, like many. I'm not sure what the percentage is, but my guess is it's probably even split. But when you get into that, you can't satisfy our requirement with 6 hours. So now you've got a fraction of the remaining 6 that are out there, ending up in 1 hour. As long as you do that, and that may be something we want to continue, but that's where we have the problems with people transferring.
It's a big problem. But Lucy, didn't you look at the number of institutions that require 8 hours in the sciences versus 6?
No, I looked at foreign languages.
Oh, the foreign languages. Okay.
But I'm more than welcome.
But I think you're right. In general, most of the universities require 8.
Mm-hmm. And we, in fact, require 9 and do just exactly what you say. Most folks meet our 9 by taking 12.
And one of the reasons why most of them at university level too is because if you require only 6, then there could be just 2-3 hour lecture classes and the lab components taken out.
Well, that's exactly the problem, though. They come in from somewhere, they've satisfied their core with 6 hours. Mm-hmm. Now, what do we do with those extra 2 hours? Should they be in the sciences? Since we require 8 in ours, but there's core complete where they're coming in. So we're saying we can put those 2 hours almost any place within the core curriculum. But those are the types of issues which we create when we go to these uneven.
Right.
If you look nationally, this kind of distribution of component areas of somewhere between 29 and 36 hours is what you'll find. Very few general education curriculums in that standard frame float above the 36 at the high. Okay, and so what you see in terms of this set of 36 is not only sort of transferable in the state, it's also sort of transferable nationally. Students come in from institutions across the United States with the idea that a college education requires people to have at least a beginning opportunity to think in a variety of disciplinary modes, which is what this piece of it, this kind of breadth piece, provides to them. I think that to mandate above that is more constraining than I would advocate for. I think there is a lot of benefit in the capacity for those extra 6 hours to be finessed for a science institution, finessed for an arts institution, finessed for various institutions across the board. And I guess from our own perspective, and we have a ton of transfer students, if a student comes in complete, a student comes in complete. If they completed their science with this number of hours and our institutional option is different, they come in complete. They come into our gates that way.
But Texas is special because they have 12 hours of required history and government,
exactly,
which is different from the other states that you mentioned.
I think the one place our folks would advocate for flexibility is the one place where we really don't have the opportunity at this moment to be flexible.
How would you handle somebody who didn't come in core complete and they had taken, say, 6 hours of science and you required 8. How would you handle that then?
Well, that's not exactly our specifics. We actually have 6 at UEAC.
Okay, but given that example, how would you handle it?
But if a person comes in with any component area completed, their component area, individual component area, is complete for us. So if they come in with an institutional option complete, whether it's totally different than ours, their institutional option is complete. Now, a student coming in with more science hours into ours, we would allow them to take count those in the institutional option, take another hour in institutional option, and move forward. And so there's some finessing that has to happen at the individual advising level. But it's really, in our particular situation, it is individual component area complete by individual component area complete.
That's actually what's required in rules.
Yeah, that's actually the law. If you complete the natural sciences component at any institution in Texas, you've completed it at any institution in Texas by law. Phil.
I just want to comment, I think the decision made by the last coordinating board to have 6 discretionary hours, in other words, I think it resolves a lot of these issues. At Alvin, for example, and many of the Gulf Coast community colleges, the 2 science labs are included in the 6 discretionary hours. So when you leave us, you'll have 8 hours of science because we're going to use 2 of those 6 hours for that. It's also where we provide the oral communication component requirement, which is mentioned about 1 million times but never validated. So 5 of those 6 hours are supplied by virtue of the institution having that discretion. And I think you can correct a lot of these things if you have some discretionary hours there, as long as the institution has them at their discretion. I can't speak for community colleges outside the Gulf Coast area. So I think that regardless of why it came about, it's really, really a good idea.
I think the question, the institutional option hours and those other 6 hours are next. Is there another way to formulate this? Is there another way to take chart 1 and throw it out the window and start again? Is there a better way to cover the broad spectrum of these foundational component areas?
Not without changing the law.
Excluding history and government. I think that's really the question. Is there another way?
Weren't these tied to Southern Association? The other 24 hours, they require a certain amount of communication and so forth and so on. Did I misunderstand that one?
Southern Association doesn't have that kind of content requirement.
Well, the Southern Association does have 3 broad categories that you have to cover: humanities and fine arts, natural sciences and mathematics, and social and behavioral sciences or something. You have to have at least 3 hours in each one of those.
So, how long a moment ago trying to define humanities, trying to separate it from social studies, and we couldn't get it done in 30 minutes. So I started to worry about whether or not we put too fine a line on social sciences and humanities, and whether or not that's not collapsible. If that would free up 3 hours, all right, that could go to somewhere else, in my mind. So if we don't want to get into the statute of history, at least 3 hours to me is disputable when we have to really wrestle. I happen to like humanities, I've taught it, but I'm not sure that I can defend it standing alone with the backdrop of social sciences.
Any reactions to that?
Yeah.
No, well, actually, I do see, to answer your question, Lucy, I see definitely 2 major areas that need to be answered, particularly the one that Bill was talking about. Just if there is any flexibility, it should be the other one. And ever since I've been part of this committee, my interest to become to this point where we actually discuss the core for life and physical sciences. I think there is a major problem thinking that science is something you can just speak about and not just really practice it. And so the flexibility that there is there in the life and physical sciences is the other area that I would like to know more about. So I want to recommend that Lucy definitely does
I'm doing it right
study.
now. I'm doing it right now.
Huh?
I'll give you the answer in about 2 minutes.
Oh,
there is also, though, the presumption that 3 hours does not include a lab.
Right, because
which I don't think is a true presumption.
Yep. There are a lot of new science courses now that are 3 hours with an integrated lab.
Yeah. So we have to be careful that we don't hold the old boxes. But what you said made me think we could potentially then, if I'm hearing you right, say we have a requirement of 9 STEM hours. In other words, group some of these into broader boxes and have the 3 of the facts.
One of the questions we get all the time is, do the 6 communication hours have to be freshman English 1 and 2? Because some institutions don't offer freshman English 1. So there'll be, English 1302 or its equivalent, and say a technical writing course or a substantial writing course in a discipline. And we've kind of tried to be as flexible as we could about that. If you start to deconstruct this a little bit, it might actually be a really useful exercise.
And in the communication area there, practicality is that at most institutions, those 6 hours are taken up by writing. Except for, I think, maybe A&M.
We have an option.
It's not just 6 hours of writing. There's an option to take something else. Other than it's 3 hours. They do have to have 3 hours of writing, though. Is that correct?
Plus 3.
But at the vast majority of institutions, we end up with 6 hours of writing in the state of Texas, which leaves the oral component, which we've said, and now visual also. Where are we going to get oral and visual out of this?
One of the discussions that we have had on many of our work group sessions and through emails and that sort of thing is, are we trying to take the current core that we have and mold it to this new one? Are we trying to take what we know we have already and change it to fit this? Or is the committee going to recommend that they re-look at their entire core to see how it fits with these new core objectives? And do we want to make 2 semesters of English, for example, to fit in there, to fit that? Or is this an institutional opportunity to come in and say, okay, communications is going to include visual and, all the variations of spoken and written communications. The current method we have right now, it does not fit that.
Well, I would support us saying that communication has to have all those elements in it. That your core, your 6 hours in the core, or 9 hours, or whatever we put in there, has to have all those elements in it. They have to be represented there. But practicality and political reality is, because the vast majority of us have those 6 hours of writing, it's going to be difficult to change that.
I still think we should try. If everything we read says the oral component is important, then in my mind I don't know how we justify it with a conscience and continue to ignore it because it's hard. Why can't we simply say you require 3 hours of English and 3 hours of oral communication?
At a minimum.
At a minimum. Or add 3 and make it 9 hours total.
We have a comment, but we've got somebody
someone waiting in line over here. And then Mark will come back to you.
David Roach from Texas Tech University. And I would add my voice to that perhaps it would be useful to have oral comm be a part of that as well. I'm not familiar that everyone, or that there is a majority of people that were using that oral comm or using communication to have 2 writings. So I would advocate for the model that would allow writing and that would allow for oral, and perhaps even open the door for visual as well.
This is one place where I think a thorough discussion of this would be called for. The original meeting where the board approved this way back when, this originally was communication which would have included English, speech, and foreign language. And a board member during the meeting said, does this mean that if I take Spanish 1 and Spanish 2, I fulfill this requirement without ever having to take an English rhetoric and composition course? And staff kind of looked at each other and said, yeah. And the board member said, I move that this component area be the required 2 semesters of freshman rhetoric comp. And it is the only restriction that the board actually voted to place upon course content in the core curriculum. And as our understanding about core and as best practices have evolved over the decade, we've done what we could to comply with that board directive and yet allow for appropriate innovation and best practice. But I think this is a really important thing. I would challenge anybody to think about, does requiring a written, a spoken or oral, and a visual component of communication require a set-aside course, one for writing and one for speaking? Or is there not a way that these could be a little bit better integrated?
Well, and I would caution, we have visual in the communication objective, but we have a category, visual and performing arts, so in the core objective doesn't mean that it has to fit into the communication foundational component.
Visual is our euphemism for digital and the sort of technology.
Right, but I'm saying
it's the objective. It's not.
It's the objective. It's not the component area.
I'm going to go with Jeff first, and then we'll come back to Julie.
Okay. Is there anything here? I guess, Catherine, I guess this question is for you more than anything else. Is there anything in here that defines that visual component as something on the order of a visual argument?
The discussion in the committee had to do with the suggestion that digital communication should be considered. And I think Celia might be able to best summarize the discussion that followed, where originally there was written, spoken, oral, as in listening, and digital communication as different components. And I believe that digital was eventually determined to be a way of communicating, a technique of communicating, rather than, and just as the last core committee thought that computer literacy was pretty important because the World Wide Web was very new in the late 90s.
Don't laugh. Look, he's laughing at us.
He's laughing.
Catherine, isn't visual communication just representing information in the forms of graphs and charts and things like that? That was the intention, I think.
That was what I was asking, is that if you were going to consider all of those as a means of creating a particular argument, where you're looking at something on the order of some sort of a recruiting poster or what have you, that makes use of those visuals in a persuasive way.
Well, how many?
That's what we're looking at. The answer to your question is yes, those can be incorporated into a 1301 English course. Certainly. We do it all the time.
Absolutely.
But we need to be careful that we're not conflating our objectives with the content. And if I'm understanding, what we're talking about now is the foundational areas, the component areas. And our visual piece is written into our objectives. And so we're covering those across the gamut at the end of the day, rather than necessarily in one of the other questions. Now your point that communication in the component area ought to include oral communication is a little bit different discussion, I think.
Let me respond to that too, Catherine Butterall. As long as I've been in education, I've had people who had a tendency to think that you could teach public speaking in your English class, as if the English teacher somehow learned rhetoric. It is a discipline. It makes as much sense to do that as to say, let's just teach some math in the speech class. And so as a consequence, it's not an overlay, it's not simple, and it's not a percentage. We do 50% of our communicating, listening and hearing. Once we exit the school system, we only spend about 25% of the time reading and writing. So when the adult world gets here, we've given them 24 semesters of reading and writing, 6 semesters of speaking. So we have all kinds of criticisms. The spelling report said that people don't listen well and their oral communication skills are bad. And so here we are, just asking for 3 hours somewhere to address this discipline, which is a unique set of skills, which becomes the collateral for everything on that board. Class participation, involvement, engagement, critical thinking, almost all of it's oral. And so if a kid isn't really skilled enough orally to do it, then you probably underestimate their intellectual ability, because verbal aptitude is what most people look at.
So
having done this for a very long time, and I don't have to worry about teaching it anymore, but I can tell you it is a major blind spot in our education system.
Would you then propose an additional foundation, and this is not saying anything, just additional foundational component of reading and writing and a specific communication component, 3 in each? Is there any way that the communication 6 hours, the institution select 3 for reading and writing and 3 for oral and oral?
The institution, in my mind, will probably look at their staff, and since they've got 4 English teachers that might have a hard time finding a job, they'll go with 6.
But here's where we have an opportunity.
Correct.
Let's propose what we think should happen.
That's my point.
So I think what Lucy's question is, what do you think should happen?
I think that in the community college right now at ours, and I can speak for ours, the 1301 is accepted by everybody when they transfer out. It's the 1302 that's getting in trouble. Several schools won't accept 1302 as a transfer. They prefer technical writing and so forth and so on. If we have the curricular space for 6 hours in communication, and if this board believes that 6 of it should be in writing and 2 English classes are necessary for freshmen and sophomores, I'm all for it. If, on the other hand, we don't have the curricular space for that 3 hours added to it, then I would be in favor of reducing the written by 3 and putting the oral in. It needs space. It needs at least as much space as the writing, or half as much if you're going to have 9.
Mark and then Larry.
Well, if we look at it from a baseline perspective, we're locked in at 12 automatically. SACS locks us in at another 15 when it says that we have to have 15 semester hours at a 2-year level, 30 at a 4-year level in humanities/fine arts, social/behavioral sciences, and natural science/mathematics. So if we start at those, we got 27 there, and then add the rest. I mean, let's get the foundation and then see what we can throw in on top.
Would you repeat those categories and numbers, please?
For degree completion in associate programs, the component constitutes a minimum of 15 semester hours or the equivalent. For bachelor programs, a minimum of 30 semester hours or the equivalent. The credit areas are to be drawn from and including at least 1 course from each of the following areas: humanities/fine arts, social/behavioral sciences, and natural science/mathematics. And those are the areas that SACS says for Gen Ed we have to have 15 or 30 in. The state says we have to have 12 in history and government combined, so we're sitting at 27.
Well, what SACS says is not exactly that, I don't think. You have to have 15 and 30 hours. At least 1 course comes from, of that 15 and 30, comes from those 3 areas.
Right.
The other 6 hours at the associate's level, or the other 21 hours at the baccalaureate level, can come from a wide variety of places, as long as they meet the further criteria that's stated in the SAC stuff about being breadth of knowledge and that sort of stuff.
15 of your hours must, if you're at a 2-year, 15 of those hours must come from those 3 areas.
9 of those hours must come from those 3 areas.
It says, for degree completion in associate programs, the component constitutes a minimum of 15 semester hours or the equivalent, and the credit hours will be drawn from and including at least 1 of the courses from each of the following areas.
One course
in each.
I understand, but you still got to have 15 total hours in those 3 areas.
But you already have 12 in social science.
No, you don't. You
one
have
of
to have
those is
15
social
hours
science.
of general education courses. You have to have 1 course drawn from each of those 3 areas. That's 9 hours, typically, with the 3-semester credit hour norm. So it's 9 hours from those 3 areas, 3 of which are already taken up in the U.S. government requirement easily. Okay, but the other 6 hours can come from anywhere, as long as they meet the further notion that they have a breadth of knowledge and whatever else it says down there. Right. But Larry, you're next.
I would like to respond to Catherine. I agree, Catherine, that we need to find a way to, because we've said that communication is across all these areas, these foundational areas. So we've got to find a way to incorporate it into each of these foundational areas. But we also have to find a way to make a baseline, because we've said that it is a foundational, we've said that it's in the core objectives, and we've also said that communication is a foundational component area. So we have to have a baseline of oral and written and visual now communication. And I argue that you've got to have some instruction within the disciplinary area in order to have that baseline. Otherwise, then you don't have anything to build on. You have students that have no foundational baseline of oral communication skills to really build in the core from that point on. Illinois and Tennessee both require 6 hours of written communication and then 3 hours of oral communication. I'm not saying that we move to 9 hours in the communication area, but I think if we're going to say that communication is one of the core objective areas, we've got to reflect that somewhere in the foundational component areas other than just the written element, which I think is going to be guaranteed. We're going to find the written at all of our institutions, but we don't find necessarily at all of our institutions the oral component or the visual component as we've now identified it.
Well, now keeping in mind that the 6 hours of written communication is a coordinating board creation, not a legislative creation, then
just communication,
written communication. But it's not a legislative requirement under the core curriculum. It's a coordinating board rule that was written into Chart 1. Okay. If we recommend, I mean, it seems to me that we could recommend that communication remain at 6 hours, for example. And the way we write the foundational component description then would allow, it seems to me then, would certainly allow an institution to choose 3 hours of English 1301, for example, and Speech 1315, or whatever, if that's what they so chose to do. I mean, I think one way to do it would then be, because if you change, the proposal that we make is going to eliminate Chart 1 and Chart 2 as they exist today and create a new schema for distributing these hours. And so through a description of the foundational component area, you could allow a written course and an oral course for 6 hours. Now on the other hand, and personally, I wouldn't have a problem if we went to 9 hours in communication and had 6 hours of written and 3 hours of oral, quite frankly, because no matter where you go, if you look at what people say about what they're looking for in graduates across the board, some of the things that pop up a lot are things like problem solving and teamwork, but written communication skills and oral communication skills always top those lists.
I think everything that this committee read before we got immediately involved in this process, oral communication skills is one of the major elements that people have said that's what we're looking for in the workforce. And that's why it ended up in the communication objective.
Danny.
The way I remember, or what I've written down from what people have said, is that the statutory requirements that we have are a minimum of 42 hours for the core, and that 12 hours of various history, government, social science. Did we as a group decide that we were going to stick to this 36-hour thing? So
that's what we're trying to decide.
So actually we've got 42 hours to work with, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So we wouldn't have to eliminate something in order to add something else.
No, except
unless we want to guarantee 6 more hours of institutional choice.
Yes.
That's right. What you really have is 30 hours to work with. 12 hours is mandated by the legislature.
Other statutes. The government and history is not
That's
part
what
of
you
the
have, 30
corporate
hours.
law. It's subsuming older statutes because they are the same function. Everybody has to finish them before they get their undergraduate degree. So,
but the minimum is, the statute is a minimum of 42 hours, but that's the minimum, not the maximum.
Right.
Right.
And yet, for many of us, it's very difficult to add more to it because of the 120 rule.
Although, if we did that, then maybe it would encourage people to get rid of some of that government. Oh, never mind.
One of the restraints in doing that is that for those people like my institution that uses those discretionary hours, if you take them away and make them component requirements for something else, then some of our majors will take them out of their elective credit, but so many of our majors have no elective credit. If you're a biomedical engineer, you don't have 1 degree of freedom in what is a 128-hour program already. So it would be very difficult for us to give up those discretionary hours without just adding them directly to the time it takes to...
And Michael, which 6 discretionary hours you're talking about? The ones that go up to 48 or the ones that go up to 42?
The 36 to 42. Okay, if we in fact said, gosh, we'll assign those 6 hours to somewhere else, we're already using those in mathematics and science. If we had to use them somewhere else, then we would just have to add those hours to our degree.
So, okay, I missed something. So collectively, this group has already decided that they're working with 36 and not 42?
No.
Okay.
No, but they were saying that we would take the 6 hours and no longer have them be institutionally designated
as an
classes, but we would add them to some category here to further embellish the core curriculum.
Well, unless we eliminated 3 hours from something else.
Right.
Bill, and then come back to Danny.
Two things. One, responding to the first thing you said, Rex, about just making it written and oral 6 hours and leaving up the institution as a possibility. Something that Catherine said earlier is already happening at my school. We have allowed people that take Spanish dual credit 1 in high school to not take oral communication. Wow. So now it's not required much. Dual credit Spanish satisfies it given the way it was written initially on those option hours. And so we've got, this year, we have 111 dual credit Spanish students who are going to walk in and will not take an oral communication class at college.
Wow.
So in my mind, if we're going to go to the 6-hour discretionary written and oral, we need to do what that original board did and mandate they are in oral and written, and they can't take a foreign language to satisfy that requirement. The other thing is, we don't have an ultimatum here. It's not a dichotomy. It's 6 hours of discretion or not. You could have 3 hours of discretion and 3 more hours mandated if that's what you decided to do. You could collapse a couple of these, as you mentioned earlier, and give more options within a 6-hour range and free up 3 more hours. So there are a lot of options here.
And that was the reason for my question, because there seemed to be some assumptions made already that certain things had already been decided on, and I think literally you're really working with 30 hours up in the air. Decide what you want to do with the 30 hours.
Take history and political science off the table and play with the rest.
Yeah. And what you're left, and that's true, what you're left with is 30 hours. Dana and then Lynn? Or
No, I was wondering, at Midwestern State, we use already 3 of those discretionary hours for speech. And I was wondering how many of you all here have a speech requirement already in your core, a great number.
Actually,
We did. I sent out. We did do that. It was the majority of institutions that did include it in as part of their Chart 2 selection. I then asked the question as why? I mean, not that they don't need it, but why was speech communication so used across the state? And I think a lot of it had to do with the old, ancient, before any of our time, SACS requirement of having a speech course in SACS, and that's part of it, as in addition to the value and importance of the course itself.
Good job.
And the faculty who's taught it.
This came up in the accountability
Danny and then Celia?
Not Lynn, too.
No, I'm okay. Danny, go.
I'm sorry, did you finish? I'm sorry, Lynn.
I was still.
Okay. Danny, and then back to Celia.
Just something to throw out to keep in mind as we talk about what we're going to do with this is we're talking about a general education core and what we think the general education core ought to be. And while certainly it's important that students, in particular majors, get the content and the skills that they need for that major, if our focus is what a general education ought to be, that shouldn't be the driving factor behind our decision making. Now, saying that, whatever.
I want to just reiterate what I said early on, is that I really advocate very strongly for maintaining the 6 hours at the institutional option. Part of that is because we have just gone through a very significant piece that put discovery and capstone into it, and our hugely a piece of our assessment process, and it gives the opportunity for that. So it would, for us to go back, this is just speaking from a totally small institution, one institution viewpoint, but for us to go back and abandon what has been a 4-year architecture of really making doorway in, doorway out, comprehensive, would be difficult. I don't have a problem with us saying that we make, either make room or allow room for speech as a part of it. But
You want to keep the 6?
I want to keep the 6, and a part of that is the state already gives us these 12. We are, with 42, we are more constraining 120 hours than our peers across the nation. And the more constraints we put on ourselves that way, the more difficult I think it makes it for us.
Don't we solve the problem by doing
Dick
that?
is next.
I go back to transfer problems. That I think that although I like the institutional option, the way the law reads, most people take a core, they come in with an institutional option completed, your institutional option is gone, because that's the only place you're going to be able to fit it in. And if the majority of our students are transfer students, even though I agree with you 100%, we should have it, we don't have it. I mean, in effect, it's gone.
Well.
And Celia, just to go back to what you said earlier, what's in the best interest of all students across the state, not just a certain number of students at your institution and what you've already put into place recently?
Right.
Jeannie?
Well, and I'll say we've done a terrible amount of work trying to assess and decide what would make our students more successful at the gen ed level. And we're hoping to have at least one institutional option left to do a learning skills course, which is becoming a huge part of what a lot of schools are trying to do to make students much more successful in their progression. So
speech class.
They'll both disappear at least.
Institutional option is
Bill?
Is there an objection? Because I haven't heard it. In other words, what she just said, that makes sense to me. You can keep the 6 hours. Just simply make the 6 hours of communication 3 written and 3 oral, and it solves all problems unless there's a major objection with taking the 3 hours out of written. And I haven't heard anybody defend that or attack that.
I don't think that the way we've written the foundational component descriptions so far, I think that allows for exactly that thing to happen. Now, that would be an institutional decision whether to keep it in 6. Keep 6 written, or whatever, or 3 and 3, or 3 oral and no written for that matter.
So the institution could have 6 hours that he usually chose.
Yeah. I mean, but the way I see it right now, and then Agnes is next, and then I'll come back to Larry.
What we were talking about earlier, 42 minus 12, they get to 30, and we're looking at a 30. I wanted to go with a few of us, what we've talked about, especially those of us who are receiving a lot of transfer students and all that, and looking at transferability, and more importantly, the applicability that we need to work with the students to give them the credits and so on. I'm looking at actually 24 hours. And I'm with you all that we need the 6 hours of RDOs to do the things that the institution has worked so hard on to do already. For instance, in our institutions, we use the 6 hours for another math course and writing intensive. Because to us, we believe that we need more writing. Don't get me wrong, Bill. Communication is very important, but we want to stress the writing. That's what our institution wants to do. So for us to wipe that off totally is going to be very difficult. So if we're all okay with the 6 RDOs, let's just look at the 24 and go, what can we do with those 24 hours? And not to mess with the 6 RDOs.
Larry?
But you just made a case for 9 hours in the communications component, basically. And so I think that's...
Not in writing.
Okay.
Not in oral communication.
Well, but that's the problem, and that's the problem with what you said, Rex, is that if we say, as a committee, and then the coordinating board approves, and this goes through, we're saying that our core objective is, in communication, we define it as written, oral, and visual. We have got to have a place for oral and visual in the core. And to just leave it open to all institutions to decide and say, hey, you decide what you want to do. And the University of Houston decides, okay, we're going to use all, if there were 9 hours there, 9 hours for written. Well, where does oral come in? How do they satisfy that? Where do they satisfy that? You
I think
have to
Agnes
make
gets
a
to
place.
answer that.
We end up with the same situation that we were in before. While we said that oral communication was important, we never made a place for it in the court.
I think we're messing the two things up again, because it's the communication skills, one of the 6 objectives that we say is written, oral, and visual. It's not the component areas.
No, I'm not messing it up. I'm saying, where are you going to get it?
It's the responsibility of the institution to put it there.
Right.
Put it where you're going to put
Right.
it. And why can't it be in a writing class?
Because you don't. I go back to the argument that I had made earlier. You have to have a foundation in oral communication to build on. If you don't have that, why don't we have then 6 hours oral communication?
Well, what I would say is to shift off of communication, but to go back to what I thought was a primary idea a couple of meetings ago. At my institution, I would love for us to see a logic class be an equivalent to math, because it has the same kind of, it meets those same overall objectives.
The coordinating board does accept logic as equivalent for math. They accept logic as satisfying the math requirement presently. But I go back to my question, then why don't we make all 6 hours and say it's all oral?
Why do we have to make any decision at all?
Because we're undereducating them orally right now. That's what we're trying to stop.
Well, that's the argument, but Mark has the floor.
One area that we could look at that we have up there right now with the current setup, we have humanities 3 hours, visual performing art 3 hours. SAC says in those 2 categories we only have to have 3 hours. That could be an area where we could look at trimming depending upon what we need to fit something else in.
Well, you could, but it would...
I understand.
I can tell you the bodies at my campus that we'd have to walk over to get there. And primarily because in the Science and Mathematics Institution, the importance of those kinds of experiences are enhanced. Because the kids have very few opportunities for that, and it's incredibly important to them.
Well, I agree with you. I'm just offering an idea.
Okay, Jeff is next, and then we'll go back. Russell.
But I think that's why we have, in the last 4 meetings we've had, talked about the component areas and why we haven't walked away from them, is because there's something inherent about their practicality.
Jeff, and then
I wasn't quite.
And Shannon, and then we'll come back to Michael. Okay, Jeff.
Oh, is mine, or are we still on yours? Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Agnes, I want to kind of follow up with something you were talking about here. If we're talking about the idea of skills here with those foundational components, if we're going to identify those as skills, we are not talking about courses, correct?
Yes, if I'm looking
Right.
at the 6 objectives, yes, skills.
Right, okay. All right. So if that's true, why are we worrying about courses to begin with?
Well, that's what Larry said.
I think Jeff's making a point I was going to bring up. If we accept the argument that because communication skills states that it should include effective written, oral, and visual communication, and we need a set-aside course for each one of those, then don't we, in social responsibility, need a course for intercultural competency, a course for civic knowledge, a course for the ability to engage effectively in regional community, another one for national community, and yet another one for global community? If you read the description in that way, then I think you run into some real roadblocks. And Jeff, I think that is supporting what you're saying.
Yes, that's exactly my point, is that if we're talking about skills, we cannot afford to confuse those with courses.
I agree.
So let's look at it as, all right, if we're talking about skills, we can deal with these skills in a lot of different places. They're not restricted that way. So if we focus our discussion that way, let's forget about the courses. Leave that out.
Okay. Shannon?
That is exactly, he said exactly what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
But there's a presumption in that.
Wait. But Shannon is next, and then Michael. And then Jana, and then Larry. No, then Bill, and then Larry.
Jeff said exactly what I wanted to say.
Okay, my remarks are now off topic. I yield the floor.
Jana's next.
Do you mind shifting back to the other slide really quickly? Can you just toggle or no?
Sure. Because she's good.
Thanks, yeah. Could we look at, I can't see it though. I can't see here and there at the same time. If we did STEM, somebody mentioned it earlier, I don't know who it was, and did 9 hours, and then if you did the social, behavioral, and humanities at 6 hours, and then institutional at 3, visual performing at 3, so you're just lumping a couple of things. And in the communication, because it's a 9-hour, you could include, because you have your objectives, written, oral, and then some campuses are going to want to include modern language, and it could be part of that category. The distribution would be dependent on the institution. But that does drop the institutional option to 3 hours. And so if you collapse those into those 5 categories instead of all of those, of course, eliminating history and government, can we look at that as an option?
The only, sure, of course we can, but I think perhaps the one flaw in that is that SACS separates humanities, fine arts from social and behavioral sciences.
But we have 6 hours there.
So yeah, but if you combine those two, then schools are still going to have to separate it in order to meet SACS requirements. Is what I'm saying. So I'm not sure that combination
that doesn't help
would really help much. But the other stuff could certainly be looked at. Yeah.
Because then with the STEM at 9, people could distribute depending on the way they offer their science, the way they offer their labs, the way they offer their math. Some campuses have 4-hour math, some have 3-hour math, giving some flexibility. I don't know if we've accomplished anything with it, but it does accomplish lumping the communication so that people then have options on what they feel like their population best needs.
Okay, Bill, Larry, and Dick.
Well, first, I think the differentiation between skills and courses is useful, except I think it kind of begs the question. In other words, we could view writing as a skill, therefore we don't need to worry about a writing course. We could view mathematics as a skill, and therefore we do a mathematics class. So I don't know what we accomplished with that, but it was fun. All right. The bottom line is, and I think this is something we avoid all the time in this discussion, the currency for interchange in college is oral. All right. There's a lot of writing, but it's mostly oral. And we don't do anything to teach kids oral if we don't work on it, and it's not something we can do as a baseline, which is what Larry continues to talk about, cross-discipline. If you start with a speech class in the freshman and sophomore year, and now you want to teach speech principles in a fine arts class, or you're going to teach it in an English class and have an oral assignment, then that works. But if they don't get a baseline of the discipline, then you're asking an English teacher, a history teacher, a math teacher, a science teacher to teach speech. And they're not geared for it. They're not trained to it. All right? And so as a consequence, it doesn't work very well that way. So bottom line is, and in addition to that, by the way, visual arts right now are visual communication is a part of almost all public speaking classes. And listening, which has been criticized as a major weakness from our educational curriculum for a number of studies, is unique to be taught in interpersonal communication. So there are areas right now that we cannot address by speaking across the curriculum without a speech foundation.
Larry.
I think I lost heart.
I was going to say, yes, those are skills, but I'm sort of a practical person. And the practicality is, how are those skills then defined into the core? And what courses are going to fit? Because we can talk on a high level of skills, but in reality, when the rubber hits the road, it's what course is this going to be done in? That's just how it is. And if we start off with a presumption, because most of us around this table require 6 hours of writing. If we start off with the presumption that 6 hours of writing in communication are going to take up the 6 hours. And it's, no matter what we say, it is going to be very difficult for us to go back to our institutions and work out another plan. That means, in essence, there is no place for those other skills to be foundationally developed.
Dick, and then with course credit.
Most of our students are now coming in with Composition 1 already completed in the high school. And if we're looking at what we're trying to do as a university, I'm going along with what Bill is saying, is that our kids are afraid to speak up in the class. They don't participate in discussions because they don't know how to do it. Encouraging that skill early on, I think, adds to what we're trying to do as an educational system. Even if it means cutting down on one writing class, because we're not teaching those writing classes anyways, for the most part. They're already, they're taking those in dual credit.
We have to count them. You still have to count them into the 120 hours.
We have to count them, but we're not teaching them. What are we trying to do as an institution?
But we are teaching them. I mean, maybe you aren't, but we are.
Pam Matthews, who's feeling a little at sea at the moment. At one point, my thought was, I will be the bloody body on there if we start talking about the humanities as thrown right in with social sciences, but that's okay. A couple of things. And let me go back to if the outcomes are there and are the important thing, we will decide how we get that done. We are teaching speech to our students. They have that 3-hour option. So this can be done, I presume, at any of your institutions. So you should go back and make exactly these impassioned cases to your institutions that you're making here and put those oral communication skills in. Also, I don't know how different Aggies got to be, but by God, they can talk their way out of anything. They're not such great writers. So I think we want to make sure that they're having all of those skills, and visual argument is a very important thing for them to be getting too. But I think I would like to really second very strongly what Catherine said earlier. If we end up thinking every competence has to go in a course somewhere, we're up to about 300 hours. So we've really got to think, what are the priorities, what are the outcomes, how are we going to get those built into our courses and assessed for the students by the time they get out of our institution. Part B, we're forgetting intellectual approach. And social sciences and humanities are really different ways of thinking about the world. So we really can't do things like lump those things together unless we've decided we don't care that our students can do all of those things. So,
Michael.
I'm back to relevance now. I could not agree more. I think social and behavioral sciences are really kind of the collective truth about the human condition, but humanities are the individual truth about the human condition. And both of those things are incredibly important, and we cannot confuse them, and we cannot sacrifice one for the other.
Sachs wouldn't let you.
I just wanted to give you the survey that I did, the rudimentary survey on the number of semester credit hours required in natural sciences. So about 70% of our institutions require at least 8 semester credit hours of natural sciences. About 20% require at least 6, minimum of 6. 10% require 7, at least 7, and one institution requires 9.
And much of that is the evolution of the traditional 2-semester lab class. Biology 1, Biology 2, Gen Chem 1, Gen Chem 2, and that's where historically they came from.
Extra hour. So I'll show my ignorance. When is the possibility of changing legislature?
Great question.
Ever? I mean, is there...
What we tried last time.
Well, last time, a bill was proposed, but it didn't go anywhere, literally.
It wasn't even laid out for a committee.
Right.
That's the answer.
So we can't predict at this point.
So, with the discussion that I've heard some about in terms of Western Civ, certainly I would presume a discussion of Western Civ would impact history government as that. I'm wondering if that may be the impetus for some of that discussion.
I think I went to some of those hearings on the Western Civ bill that would have created the College of Western Civilization at UT Austin last year, or something along those lines. And there wasn't a discussion about what to take away from the core if something like that became more widespread across the state. So it was pretty restricted at that time.
But hadn't there been a discussion recently? Some elected official is is arguing for.
This committee heard from the staff of a representative of the legislature who is very interested in having a specific core course or set of courses targeting civic engagement and responsibility. And as if 12 credit hours wasn't already enough. But I think the concern is if those 12 credit hours are just a rehash of what they've already had in high school and taught sort of by rote, then that's an issue because it doesn't really lead to civic engagement, the kinds of things that Mike was talking about.
Can I just ask Kevin one more question? If that was a recommendation of this committee that we adjust the government in history, is there someone that would lobby for us?
Not at the coordinating board. We're not allowed to lobby. So you guys would have to do the lobby.
There we go. This is the heart of the battle that I was hoping to get to.
So we would have to find a champion somewhere.
Well, I think the risk that we run in asking the legislature at this juncture to invite them to meddle into statutory changes for higher ed is a frightening and daunting time because of the deficits that are coming. They need something to take home to their constituents, and it's not going to be moneyed projects anymore. It's going to be legislation that's changing things, and I think my personal fear is if we invite statutory change right now, then we're inviting in a whole lot more, what's the word I'm looking for, hyper-involvement than we may want.
One thing about it, however, the changes we're talking about don't cost anything.
Nope.
And so I found, where my board is concerned, they'll do anything that doesn't cost any money. So when times are tough, if we can bring changes to them that don't cost them anything, they'll want to do it quickly because, again, there's no downside for them.
Yeah, but then we bring the change to them, and I agree with you, Bill. I mean, I'm not arguing against what you're saying, but then when we say we want this change and it comes back, well, we're going to add 12 hours in Western Civ on top of the 12 hours of government. You know that, or where you don't have an ethics course in your core, you have personal responsibility. We want 6 hours of ethics. That's my personal fear that I think right now in the environment we're in, we have to guard against.
I sent Russell and Rex and then the folks on my subcommittee a couple of articles specifically dealing with this, and a member of the legislature that is strongly advocating, and I think one of those articles was at a hearing recently advocating for additional hours or additional instruction in civic engagement and Western civilization. So we might end up with more than even 12.
If you want to send me those sites, I'll make sure that they get distributed to the full committee so everybody can be aware of them.
We can put them on the UEAC website.
Maybe we ought to construct a course in political science that is oral communication based. So you have exchanges in oral communication around political science.
Demonstrating civic engagement.
That's right. Demonstrate civic engagement within that.
Well, it would be in the Plato and Aristotle tradition, particularly Plato.
So can we outline what our mandatories are and then build from there?
Sure. Well, our mandatories are the 6 hours in U.S. history and the 6 hours in government.
And then what SACS mandates, and then from there we have opens.
Yeah. And then on top of that, you need to have 3 hours in humanities or visual and performing arts to meet the SACS mandate, and then 3 hours in mathematics or natural sciences.
And
so you really have an 18-hour base. Now, so your U.S. government course is going to cover your social and behavioral sciences for SACS. So given SACS and the legislative requirements in Texas, then you have 18 hours of that 42 that are sort of given to you by outside entities. And that leaves you with 24.
So the social and behavioral science you just said is covered by U.S. history?
For SAC's purposes.
For SAC's purposes.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that would be debatable, but it would certainly be covered by the U.S. government.
I think it would depend upon how you list it in your catalog, too.
Yeah, because
our catalog doesn't list it under either, so we'd have to look at it separately.
Because, in some places, history is considered part of humanities, in other places it's considered a social science. And so a lot would depend on the person on your committee looking at your gen ed requirements and what they want to think about that.
Political science is certainly considered a social and behavioral.
Yeah, so your social science requirement by SACS is covered by your U.S. government requirement. And that's why I said you have those 12 hours, plus you have the 3 hours of humanities and fine arts that SACS wants to see, and the minimum of 3 hours of mathematics and natural sciences. So of that 42, there are 18 given to you by the state and by SACS, and then that leaves you with, 24? So
I just heard you buy back 3 hours from the core curriculum. I just heard you say you could double dip social and behavioral sciences with government and history.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah, clearly.
That's what I heard.
Yeah, I hate the notion.
Students can't.
I do too.
But I seems that I heard you say that there's 3 discretionary hours right there.
That's right. I don't want to be the one to carry that back to the.
I heard you say that, Rex.
But it's true. Yeah.
I think here's where we are. I mean, we're at the conclusion of our day. I found the conversation the last hour to be particularly insightful and helpful. I don't know if we have consensus. I'm not even sure if we have anything that is close to a proposal. But I think we have identified what the issues are going to be that we need to think about. So your assignment between now and the next meeting is to look at the component areas and bring back some recommendations that you would have us consider, and how these would be structured out, how you would structure the hours. In the meantime, we will have a work group with the coordinators of your groups and the work group that we've been that's been producing proposals for us. Bring back description from the component areas that reflect the conversation you've had today. So expect lots of wordsmithing at our next meeting, which will be in September.
And Russell, can I make a suggestion? Instead of asking everyone in the group to come back with ideas for the distribution of semester credit hours for the core, what if the leadership of the committee, along with coordinating board staff and the subcommittee that we worked with earlier today, came back to the committee at the next meeting with several scenarios based on the discussions that we've had today? One scenario is keep things the way they are. Another scenario is what Rex described as meeting all of the requirements and then filling in the gaps.
Right.
And then there may be a couple of other scenarios that we can come up with based on the notes that we look at from this meeting.
And we would try to get that out well in advance
Absolutely.
of the next meeting.
Yeah. But rather than asking for 24 scenarios, why don't we come to you guys with a couple of scenarios?
And if you don't like any of them, well, that's
Start all over
important to know.
Well, I would add to that then, in our preparation for that, if you have specific ideas or proposals, email those to us soon, and we will integrate those into the conversation that we bring back to you.
Can we still send descriptions from our own?
Oh yeah,
Yes.
We want that all to come this week. That's a separate.
Yeah, that's a separate exercise.
Yes. So to be again, just to reiterate the email policy procedure, if you would like information to be distributed amongst all UEAC members, we have a couple of options. Well, if you send them to Catherine or I, we will be happy to distribute that. So please be careful when you're sharing information on that level. As far as getting information to us or to Russell or to Rex, obviously you have your roster with everybody's name on it and email address. But you're shaking your head as in no?
Don't send email to more than a quorum of this group at one time, or we violate open meetings.
Right.
Okay?
So please send it to Catherine or I. Catherine's on vacation next week, so, and I don't get much email, and I feel very lonely. So please. as far as your it seems to me that there are two reports that we're looking for is the descriptions, and if you can get those to me by the end of the week, that will be super. And then the hour, do we want a deadline on that, Rex, Russell?
Well, we're going to work on the hours stuff.
Oh, well, never mind, then forget that part.
Yeah.
But if you have ideas for how you want the hours to be distributed, email those to me as soon as possible so that we can.
And Russell will then take it upon himself to communicate with us.
If you would email it to the two of us,
yes.
Then we'll take
Bobbsey
it upon
Twins of the UEAC.
Can I ask a question about timeline now?
Yes.
Because it appears now that we have pushed our timeline back.
I think you're right.
This proposal was originally to go to the coordinating board
January.
in January?
January.
I thought originally there was discussion in October, but now it's January.
We had always said the very earliest possible time would be October, but I think at the last meeting we realized that we were going to need to say at least January.
And if it were to go to October, the rules would have to be revised by the 1st of July?
Yeah.
To post it publicly for public comment. So if we move it to January, if we're shooting for January, the rules will have to be revised by basically October 1st.
And because we've got these deadlines ahead of a board meeting, it's almost a quarter ahead of the board meeting that the decision points have to have been reached for recommendations and the report has to be written. And that's a lot of work to imagine by early in the fall semester. Which brings me to a question about the date for the next meeting. We've been thinking either late August or early September, and Lucy has found that the board room is open each of the Fridays in September right now. If we have a boardroom, because starting later this month or in July, because we will be staying in this building for the next 10 years and have renegotiated the lease fairly favorably, the boardroom will be moving down to the first floor, as will HR and the other public access points for the agency. We will be converting a lot of our current meeting room space into office space, and we need to be sure that when we are going to hold a meeting, we have meeting space that's appropriate.
From what I understand is in the plan that the board is not going to go away. It may not be as large as it is now, but it's going to be somewhere, so we may be cozy.
We will have meeting space of some kind for you all. I know that we want to meet as promptly as we can, but I am assuming that if classes begin in late August, nobody's going to want to come here much before mid-September. Would that be accurate?
Yes. That's accurate.
So the Fridays in September are September 3rd, 10th, 17th, and 25th. And if we have a sense of your will, we can go ahead and tentatively reserve the boardroom wherever it happens to be at that point.
24th.
Not 3. 25th?
24th.
24th.
You said 24th.
Okay.
Yes, that's my inability to count. I should take a math course.
The first couple of weeks of
17th, according to
Catherine, I thought you said yesterday that the committee was considering meeting in mid-August or early August. Is that out?
Would that be possible?
I thought that's what you was said.
I thought she said the work group.
As long as it's not the end of August.
The work group needs to be the beginning of August.
Very difficult.
We were talking about in a couple of weeks.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Summer school ending would have to be mid to late, August.
Well, we were actually talking about the work group meeting in August.
So, September 17th, September 24th, September 10th, what do you think?
17th.
17th?
Is the
Put a hold on Friday the 17th.
Email address.
And Russell has a new email address that he will email to us, and we will change the roster.
I think today has confirmed why I value our time together so much. I've learned a great deal from listening to the conversation. And even if we've had circular arguments, they've been enjoyable circular arguments and insightful ones. So I appreciate your willingness to dialogue about the important issues that affect what we do on a daily basis. But at the driver behind all of that is what brings us all here is students. And so I think we owe our new student member a great deal of gratitude for his willingness to be a part of our team. I'd ask you, Christopher, if you have any insights or charges from today's meeting that you want to leave us with.
What do you think we need to do?
Tell us how to fix it, Christopher.
Well, I think you'll probably be sorely disappointed with anything I have to offer, because I have like a page full of notes here. But I would reiterate what the representative from A&M said about folding humanities and social sciences together. And also, just to lend some credence to the University of Texas at Dallas, from my friends across the state who are involved in engineers and science, the few courses in the core that they have, that they get the opportunities to take courses in the classics or in philosophy or in art history, are a nice break and something that they really look forward to. So I would really encourage you to not take that away from them, as well as the fact that we're trying to revise the ideas for a general education. What constitutes someone who is able to function in the society with a general foundation-based knowledge in a variety of subject areas. So trying to fold 2 subjects from 6 credit hours into 3 undermines that idea. So I just would caution everyone to think about the bigger picture.
Thank you.
But I think she offered that.
But before we dismiss, if we could have the coordinators of the subgroups get together briefly, and if we have anyone who's representing any course that has been taught in the visual and performing arts that would be willing to lead us in singing Happy Birthday to Catherine. Into the microphone.
She's the music background.
I think we can end the webcast at this point.
Are we ready? Happy birthday.